There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs only to men who are too complicated for the age they live in. Men who read poetry in the middle of wars, who admire the enemies of their country, who follow orders they privately doubt, and who, in the end, are held responsible for horrors they may not have directly commanded, but which happened, nonetheless, on their watch, under their name. History does not always know what to do with men like that. It cannot fully condemn them, and it cannot fully excuse them. So it does something worse. It leaves the question open. This is the story of one such man. His name was Masaharu Homma. He was a Japanese general who loved British theatre, wrote poetry in his private hours, and reportedly wept when given the assignment that would destroy him. He commanded the invasion of the Philippine Islands in 1941 and 1942, defeated the largest American-led force ever to surrender in the field, and was then quietly discarded by the very empire he had served, punished not for cruelty, but for slowness, not for atrocity, but for taking 5 months to do what Tokyo had demanded in 50 days. And yet, under his command, or rather, in the catastrophic vacuum where his command should have been, tens of thousands of prisoners of war were forced to march roughly 100 kilometers through tropical heat without adequate food, water, or medical care. Men collapsed on the road and were beaten, bayoneted, or simply left to die. American and Filipino soldiers who had already surrendered, who were already sick and starving, were marched until many of them could march no further. The number who died is still debated by historians, but it runs into the thousands. Some estimates are far higher. The event became known as the Bataan Death March, and it remains one of the most notorious atrocities in the history of the Second World War. How do you place those two things together in a single human life? The poet general and the death march, the reluctant conqueror and the prisoners rotting on a jungle road, the man who demanded restraint from his troops in China, and the man in whose name those same troops committed acts of barbarity in the Philippines. That is the question this documentary exists to ask. Not to answer cheaply, because there is no cheap answer, but to ask honestly, following Homma's life from its beginning to its end, letting the full weight of what he did and what was done in his name settle slowly, the way all genuinely complicated things must settle. He was born on the island of Sado, off the coast of Niigata Prefecture, in 1887. Not a place that produced many generals. Not a place that pointed obviously toward any of what was to come. He would go on to study at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, serve as a military attaché in London during the 1920s, absorb British culture so deeply that colleagues back in Japan began to regard him as dangerously westernized, rise through the ranks of an army that was simultaneously modernizing and radicalizing, serve in China, navigate the treacherous factionalism of an officer corps increasingly dominated by ultra-nationalist cliques, and then, in the final months of 1941, received the assignment he reportedly did not want, command of the 14th Army, with orders to take the Philippines. Tokyo gave him 50 days. The defenders held for more than 4 months. That gap between what was expected and what actually happened cost Homma everything. Not his life, not immediately, but his career, his reputation, his standing within the institution he had served for decades. By the time the Philippines fell, Tokyo was already treating him as an embarrassment. He returned to Japan and retreated into painting and poetry. He sat out the rest of the war as a man the Imperial Japanese Army had quietly decided to forget. He might have lived out his remaining years that way. Obscure, retired, the general the empire preferred not to discuss. But history had other plans. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, The survivors of the Bataan Death March had been telling their stories for years. American military investigators had been building a record. The names of the dead had been accumulating in files and testimonies, and the memories of men who had walked that road and somehow made it to the other side. When the machinery of post-war justice began to turn, it turned in Homma's direction. He was arrested, transported to Manila, and tried before a military tribunal convened under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur, the same MacArthur who had commanded the forces that Homma defeated, whose men had walked the death march, whose decision to leave the Philippines had been one of the most controversial acts of the entire Pacific War. The trial was swift. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. His American wife fought for him. Prominent legal figures in the United States argued that the proceedings were revenge dressed as justice. The defense raised genuine and serious concerns about MacArthur's dual role as both convening authority and final arbiter of the sentence, a conflict of interest so fundamental that under any civilian legal standard it would have been disqualifying. Appeals reached the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to intervene. President Harry Truman reviewed the case and let the sentence stand. On the 3rd of April 1946, Masaharu Homma was executed by firing squad near Manila. He asked only one thing: to face his executioners. He did not want to be shot in the back. He was 58 years old. What follows across the chapters of this documentary is the full story of that life. Not a defense, and not a prosecution, but a genuine accounting. We will follow Homma from the rural island of his birth, through the military academies, across the sea to London, back through the corridors of an increasingly dangerous Japanese officer corps, into China, into the Philippines, and finally into the courtroom where his fate was decided. We will spend time with the men who marched the road he ordered guarded, and the men who guarded it with such catastrophic indifference to human life. We will look honestly at what he knew, what he should have known, and what was done while he was, by his own account, and by considerable evidence, effectively sidelined from the campaign he was nominally commanding. We will not resolve the tension between the man and his legacy, because that tension is real, and real things deserve to be held rather than dissolved. If you are settling in tonight, whether you are lying in the dark with this playing softly beside you, or drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, know that what you are about to hear is the kind of history that stays with you, the kind that asks questions that outlast the answers. Masaharu Homma has been called a war criminal, a scapegoat, a poet, a failure, and a gentleman soldier of a type that his era was busy destroying. He was probably several of those things at once. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. You have time, and this story has been waiting a long time to be told in full. If this is the kind of history you want more of, patient, serious, built for the long hours of the night, then stay with this channel. Subscribe if you have not already, and let the algorithm know that you are the kind of person who wants the full story, not just the headline. The island of Sado is quiet now. The sea around it moves the same way it always has. Whatever shaped the boy who grew up there, whatever forces of empire and ambition and circumstance carried him from that island to the jungles of Luzon to a courtyard near Manila, it all began, as everything does, at the beginning. There is an island off the northwest coast of Japan that the rest of the country has always treated as something slightly apart from itself. Sado sits in the Sea of Japan like a comma pressed into cold water, separated from the mainland of Niigata Prefecture by a channel that freezes the spirit even when it does not freeze the surface. It is an island that has historically received what the mainland wished to forget: exiled nobles, condemned criminals, poets deemed too dangerous for the capital. The ground beneath Sado is threaded with old gold mines, worked by men who went in healthy and came out broken, or did not come out at all. The winters come hard and long off the open sea, and the people who endure them develop a particular quality that outsiders sometimes mistake for coldness, and insiders understand as endurance. It was onto this island, into a family that carried the memory of samurai blood without the wealth that once accompanied it, that Masaharu Homma was born in 1887. He arrived into a Japan that was in the middle of remaking itself so completely and so rapidly that the country his parents had grown up in barely resembled the country that would shape their son. The Meiji era had been running for roughly 2 decades by the time Homma drew his first breath, and the transformation it had set in motion was unlike anything the Japanese archipelago had experienced in centuries of careful isolation. Emperor Meiji had come to power in 1868, and within a generation, his government had dismantled the feudal architecture of the Tokugawa shogunate, abolished the formal samurai class, opened Japan's ports and mines to Western technology, and begun constructing a modern nation-state with an urgency bordering on desperation. Foreign engineers, military advisors, and scholars flooded into Japanese cities. Japanese students and officials flooded out of them, dispatched to Europe and America to absorb everything that might be transplanted back home. The railway came, the telegraph came, the modern army and navy came, and woven through all of it, given official blessing and careful cultivation, came a reinvigorated nationalism that found its center of gravity in the figure of the emperor himself, divine, absolute, and newly restored to symbolic authority after centuries of shogunal rule. For a family on Sado with samurai ancestry and no particular political power, this transformation was both distant and intimate. The old world that had once defined their worth was gone. The new world was still being written. Homma's father was a man shaped by the cusp of these two eras, old enough to remember the weight and meaning of samurai identity, and young enough to understand that the future would belong to those who could navigate the new order rather than mourn the old one. He was not wealthy. Sado was not a wealthy island. But there was in the household an emphasis on discipline, on comportment, on the idea that a man of good lineage owed it to that lineage to make something of himself through effort rather than expectation. Education was treated not as a luxury, but as a form of duty. Reading was encouraged. Correct behavior was enforced. The young Masaharu grew up in a home where the gap between what you were and what you were expected to become was kept constantly visible, a kind of productive pressure that could crush a child of the wrong temperament and forge one of the right. He appears to have been the latter. Those who later wrote about him in his professional life consistently reached back to a picture of a man who had been taught, very early, that self-discipline was not merely admirable, but morally necessary. The physical world of Sado left its own kind of mark. The island is beautiful in the way that austere places sometimes are, its coastline cut by the sea into shapes that have no interest in being gentle. The interior rises into hills covered in cedar and oak. In winter, the cold comes in from Siberia, across open water, and does not apologize for itself. There were no great cities, no cosmopolitan distractions, no particular reason to expect that a boy born there would one day attend the theatre in London, or correspond with foreign officers, or command armies across a tropical archipelago thousands of miles to the south. Sado gave its children other things: an intimacy with hardship, a comfort with solitude, a tendency toward inner life that perhaps explains why the young Masaharu, even as he pursued a military career, never quite stopped reading, never quite stopped writing, and never quite became the uncomplicated soldier that his institution perhaps preferred. The island had made him reflective in a profession that did not always reward reflection. The Meiji government's project of building a modern nation required modern soldiers, and it built the institutions to produce them. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were not inherited from the past in any functional sense. They were constructed almost from scratch on Western models, first French and then German, in their primary influences. Military service was reframed not as the exclusive inheritance of the old warrior class, but as the sacred obligation of every loyal subject. The army became, in the ideology of the era, the physical embodiment of the nation's will and the emperor's divine purpose. For a boy from a samurai family on Sado, this ideological architecture was both familiar and newly charged with national meaning. The old obligations of the warrior tradition were not being discarded. They were being repackaged, made universal, and given the force of modern state apparatus. Service to the emperor was not a metaphor. It was a career path, an identity, and in the right circumstances, a path out of the provincial obscurity of an island that history tended to overlook. It would be too simple to say that Homma chose the military because he had no other options, and too simple to say he chose it because the nationalism of his age swept him along without reflection. The truth appears to have been more complicated and more personal. He was, by all accounts, genuinely drawn to the institution, genuinely willing to submit to its disciplines, and genuinely capable of thriving within it. But he was also, from early on, something the army was not quite designed to accommodate. A person with an interior life, richer and more varied than the institution tended to cultivate or appreciate. He read literature. He wrote poetry. He was curious about the world beyond Japan, in a way that felt authentic rather than performative. These qualities did not make him a bad soldier. They made him an unusual one. And in an army that was moving, decade by decade, toward a harder and more ideologically rigid conception of what an officer should be, unusual was not always an advantage. The Japan that shaped Homma's childhood was also beginning to show its teeth abroad. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 confirmed Japan's emergence as a genuine regional power and delivered Taiwan into Japanese hands. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 stunned the Western world by ending in Japanese victory, the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European great power in full-scale war. These events reverberated through every level of Japanese society, and they reverberated with particular force through the institutions preparing the next generation of military officers. Japan had proven it could fight and win by modern methods. The question being debated in academies and staff rooms and government ministries was what it should do with that capability, and in what direction it should point its ambitions. For a young man from Sado, growing up in the wake of these national triumphs, the military was not merely a career. It was participation in a national story that seemed, in those years, to be heading somewhere extraordinary. The Meiji Emperor himself died in 1912, when Homma was 25 years old and already well into his formation as an officer. The death of Meiji was mourned as something larger than the passing of one man. He had presided over a transformation so total that his reign had functioned almost as a second founding of Japan, and his departure left a question hanging in the air that the following decades would answer in ways that nobody in 1912 fully foresaw. What would Japan become now that the extraordinary pressure of initial modernization had eased? The institutional architecture of a great power was in place. The military was modern. The economy was growing. And beneath all of it, older currents of thought about honor, about racial destiny, about the emperor's divine right to rule an expanding sphere, were gathering force and waiting for the right political climate to surface. Homma would grow old inside that gathering storm. He would sometimes push against it, and more often be carried by it, and in the end, it would consume him. He left Sado for his formal education, and did not, in any meaningful sense, return. The island had done its work, had made him disciplined and enduring, and inward-facing in ways that would persist throughout his life, and now the mainland and its institutions took over. The boy who had grown up watching winter seas off the coast of Niigata would in time walk the streets of London, observe European armies on maneuver, and command tens of thousands of men in a campaign that would become one of the most examined and debated episodes of the Second World War. None of that was visible yet. What was visible, in 1887, was a child born into a Japan, convulsing with purpose, on an island that taught its people to endure, to a family that believed lineage carried obligation. The combination would produce a man capable of great things, and, by the accidents of history and the failures of his own institution, implicated in terrible ones. The story begins here, in the cold and the quiet of Sado, before any of the consequences were written. The Imperial Japanese Army Academy stood as one of the most demanding institutions in the Meiji world, a place where the sons of Japan were remade, stripped of softness, and rebuilt according to a precise and unforgiving ideal. To earn a place there was already a distinction. To thrive was something else entirely. When Masaharu Homma passed through its gates as a young man in the early years of the 20th century, he entered a world governed by iron routine, collective pressure, and an unspoken understanding that personal feeling was a luxury the officer corps could not afford. The academy's rhythms were punishing by design. Pre-dawn physical regimens, tactical exercises that stretched through mud and cold, and an academic curriculum demanding command of mathematics, military history, and strategic doctrine simultaneously. For most cadets, survival was the primary ambition. For Homma, something more complicated was already at work. He was not physically imposing in the way that military mythology tends to celebrate. What distinguished him from his earliest days at the academy was not his bearing in the drill yard, but the quality of his attention, the manner in which he absorbed everything around him with a precision that his instructors noted and, in some cases, found slightly unnerving. He was meticulous with his studies, in ways that went beyond what the curriculum demanded, reading into subjects with a hunger that suggested genuine intellectual curiosity rather than the calculated ambition of a man merely chasing marks. His peers were largely focused on the martial fundamentals, weapons, formations, command theory, and few of them were tempted by what lay outside that framework. Homma was drawn, almost against the grain of his environment, toward literature. He read poetry. He engaged with drama. He found in written language a dimension of human experience that the barrack square could not offer, and he did not regard this interest as a contradiction of his military identity. To him, they were compatible. To many around him, they were not. Japan in these years was a nation in the grip of a profound and sometimes violent transformation. The Meiji Restoration had dismantled the old feudal order and replaced it with something deliberately modern. A constitutional government, a conscript army, a navy modelled in part on Britain's, a bureaucratic apparatus reaching into every prefecture and town. The old samurai class, from which families like Homma's drew their identity and pride, had been legally abolished. Yet the culture those families carried had not vanished. It had been absorbed into the officer corps of the new imperial military, repackaged as Bushido, the way of the warrior, and offered back to a modernizing nation as proof that technological progress and ancient honor were not in conflict. For a young man shaped by Sado's rural severity and his family's lineage, this fusion of old and new was not abstract ideology. It was the water he swam in, and yet, even within that current, Homma found ways to move at an angle. The Academy's faculty shaped officers through a system that prized collective discipline above individual expression, and the culture of the Cadet Corps reinforced this relentlessly. To stand out was acceptable, even encouraged, if one stood out in approved ways, through physical courage, tactical brilliance, or the kind of composed authority under pressure that suggested command potential. To stand out through intellectual quirk, through artistic inclination, through an openness to foreign ideas, was a more ambiguous achievement. Homma managed to navigate this environment without becoming invisible or marginal, which speaks to a social intelligence that was itself a kind of skill. He was not a rebel. He was not a dissenter. He earned his grades. He performed his duties, and he gave his superiors little cause for formal complaint. But the texture of who he was, the poet alongside the soldier, was already visible to anyone paying close attention. He graduated from the academy into an officer corps that was itself in a state of rapid evolution. Japan had won a stunning victory against Russia in 1905, a shock to the European powers, who had assumed that an Asian nation could not defeat a continental European empire on land and at sea. That victory had validated Japan's military modernization and produced a generation of senior officers who believed, with considerable justification, that their approach to war had been proven correct. But the validation had also calcified certain assumptions. The lessons drawn from the Russo-Japanese War were absorbed selectively, with the elements that confirmed existing preferences: the offensive spirit, the willingness to absorb enormous casualties in frontal assault, the primacy of morale over materiel, elevated above the more uncomfortable findings about logistics, firepower, and the cost of bold action against prepared defenses. Homma's early career unfolded inside this institutional culture, one that was ambitious and capable, but already inclined to believe what it wished to believe. His first postings as a junior officer placed him inside the administrative and staff functions of a modernizing army, rather than on any active frontier. This suited his nature, though it could easily have bred frustration in a man more purely hungry for battlefield distinction. Homma moved through these early assignments with a thoroughness that drew positive assessments from superiors, without generating the kind of dramatic reputation that accelerated some careers. He was a planner. He was a writer of clear and incisive reports. He had the capacity to hold complex operational problems in his head and articulate solutions with a lucidity that was genuinely uncommon. In staff culture, these gifts mattered enormously. In the mythology of the warrior, they were less celebrated. Homma understood both registers and operated between them with a quiet fluency that those around him often underestimated. It is worth pausing on that word, contemplative, because it captures something real about how Homma experienced his own interior life, even as he performed the outward role of a rising imperial officer. He kept returning to literature. He wrote poetry himself, in the Japanese tradition, and there is in that practice a discipline as rigorous as any military art. The compression of feeling into form, the demand that no word be wasted, the insistence that what is left unsaid carries as much weight as what is expressed. For a man who by profession was required to translate complex reality into executable orders, poetry may have served as the counter-movement, the space where ambiguity was not a failure, but the entire point. This private dimension of Homma's character was not hidden exactly, but it was not advertised either. He wore it quietly, the way a man might carry a conviction he knows the room will not easily share. The contradictions multiplied as he rose, rigidly disciplined in his professional conduct, demanding of subordinates, precise in his expectations, unsentimental about the gap between standards and performance. He was simultaneously capable of warmth and intellectual generosity in personal encounters that surprised those who expected only the formal officer. Men who served under him in these early years would later recall a commander who held them to exacting standards and yet somehow communicated that he saw them as individuals rather than interchangeable parts of a military machine. This was not a universal quality in the Imperial Japanese Army, where the relationship between officer and enlisted man was often defined by distance and, in its worst expressions, casual brutality. Homma's version of discipline was harder to define and, some would argue, harder to sustain. It required the officer to actually think about the men in front of him, and thinking, in a system that prized instinct and aggression, was not always rewarded. Japan was also watching Europe in these years, with the close attention of a nation that understood it was still learning. The great European armies, French, German, British, were the models against which the imperial military measured itself, sending officers abroad for observation and study, importing doctrine and equipment, hiring foreign advisors, and translating military manuals with the same disciplined hunger for useful knowledge that had driven the broader Meiji project. The army that Homma was climbing through was not a static institution. It was restless, acquisitive, and acutely conscious of its own place in the hierarchy of global military power. Officers who could engage with foreign military thought, who could read in European languages and report back with genuine analytical clarity, were valuable, at least in principle. In practice, the growing nationalist factionalism inside the army was beginning to complicate that calculus in ways that would eventually touch Homma directly. His personal bearing carried something that his contemporaries, who had never left Japan, sometimes struggled to place. There was an ease with ideas from outside the Japanese world, an absence of the reflexive defensive pride that made some officers treat foreign influence as a threat to be acknowledged and then promptly rejected. Homma was genuinely interested in Western culture, not as material to be processed and discarded, but as something to be understood on its own terms. Where this openness came from is not entirely clear from the record of his early years. Some of it was almost certainly temperamental, the natural disposition of a man who read widely and resisted the comfort of settled certainties. Some of it reflected the specific moment of his formation, a period in Japan's history when engagement with the outside world still felt like strength rather than contamination. Whatever its source, this quality would eventually become one of the most consequential things about him, both a professional asset and, in the hardening ideological climate of the 1930s, a mark that his enemies would use against him. The young officer who emerged from the academy and moved through his first postings was already, in this sense, a man slightly out of phase with the institution he served, not rebelliously, not conspicuously, but in the way that a note played in a slightly different key from the surrounding harmony creates a tension that most listeners cannot quite identify, but nonetheless feel. He had the credentials, the discipline, the demonstrated competence that the system recognized and rewarded. He also had the poet's interior, the cosmopolitan's curiosity, the administrator's preference for clarity over glory. In an army that was moving, with increasing momentum, toward a vision of war as transcendent national mission, rather than calculated political instrument, these qualities made Homma useful and, at the same time, quietly suspect. He was already accumulating the profile of a man who would be needed precisely because of what he was, and resented for exactly the same reason. The road ahead was long, and for now, it pointed upward. But the shape of the destination had already been quietly determined by what he had chosen to be in these formative years, and what he had not. He arrived in London as a young officer with a precise uniform, careful manners, and a mind already restless with questions that the Imperial Japanese Army had never quite been designed to answer. The posting came as something of a surprise, not because Homma lacked the credentials for it, but because assignments of this kind, attaching a Japanese officer to the British military establishment for observation and liaison, required a particular kind of man. He had to be presentable to foreigners, capable of navigating social worlds far removed from the barracks and the parade ground, and intelligent enough to absorb information that could not be gathered from any manual. Homma fit that description with room to spare. He spoke enough English to manage, and he was determined to speak far more by the time he left. He crossed the distance between Tokyo and London, carrying the measured confidence of a man trained to perform under scrutiny, but also something quieter underneath it, a genuine hunger to understand the world beyond the islands where he had been formed. London, in the 1920s, was a city still processing what the previous decade had done to it. The Great War had ended only a few years before Homma's arrival, and its shadow lay across everything. The missing faces in certain families, the particular silence around certain subjects in certain clubs, the monuments going up in squares and churchyards all across the country. Britain had won, in the technical sense of the word, but winning had cost something enormous, and any attentive observer who walked the streets and talked to people long enough would understand that the nation was not celebrating so much as recovering. Homma was an attentive observer. He read the English newspapers. He listened in officers' messes and drawing rooms. He understood, perhaps more clearly than many of his contemporaries back in Tokyo, that the war fought between 1914 and 1918 had not simply ended an era. It had rewritten the mathematics of military power entirely, and any army that had not absorbed that lesson was already preparing to fight the wrong war. What he saw in the British military establishment impressed him in ways that had little to do with glory or ceremony. What impressed him was system. The British had spent the war years, and the years after them, in a serious, sometimes agonized examination of what modern industrial conflict actually demanded. The logistical chains required to sustain armies of hundreds of thousands in the field, the coordination between infantry and artillery, and the new machinery of aviation and armor. The question of how a command structure could remain coherent across a front measured not in miles, but in the ambitions of entire continents. These were not abstractions for the British officers Homma met. Many of them had stood in the mud and watched the theories fail in real time. They had rebuilt their thinking from those failures, and they spoke about the process with a directness and intellectual honesty that Homma found both admirable and, on reflection, rare. He had not encountered this quality in the same form inside the Japanese system, where the admission of institutional failure could carry political consequences. It was not only in military circles that Homma was educating himself. He went to the theatre. This was not a casual diversion. It became something close to a discipline for him, an immersion in the way a culture expressed its own interior life to itself. He attended productions in the West End, sat in galleries and stalls among Londoners who had no idea they were watching a Japanese officer absorb their civilization like a student absorbing a text. He read plays. He read English poetry with the same seriousness he brought to his military reading, and he began writing his own verses in Japanese, carrying the rhythms and emotional registers of what he was reading in London back into a form rooted in his own language. It was a private practice, one that most of his fellow officers would have found eccentric at best. But for Homma, it was a way of processing everything that was happening to him, a way of holding the two worlds he now inhabited in some kind of relation to each other, without forcing them to collapse into one. He made friends among Western officers, genuine friendships of the kind that cross professional courtesy and reach something more personal. These were men of different backgrounds, different nations, different assumptions about how the world was ordered and who deserved to sit at the top of it. Homma was not naive about the racial attitudes embedded in British society. He was a Japanese man in a city that considered itself the administrative center of a global empire, and he would have encountered, in small ways, and sometimes larger ones, the casual condescension that empire produces in those who benefit from it. But he navigated this with the same composure he brought to everything else, and the friendships he built were evidently real enough to endure. He came away from Britain with a personal understanding of Western officers as human beings rather than as categories, and that understanding would mark him for the rest of his life in ways both enriching and, eventually, dangerous. What Homma absorbed in Britain also included something more difficult to name, a set of values, or at least an exposure to a set of values that sat uneasily against certain things he knew were happening and would continue to happen within the Japanese military system. He had encountered, in British mess conversations and London drawing rooms and the theatre and the newspapers he read with his morning tea, a version of the argument that military power existed to serve political ends defined by something broader than the will of commanders, that soldiers had obligations not only to their orders, but to certain ideas about how human beings. These ideas were imperfectly practiced in Britain, as Homma was intelligent enough to observe. Empire had always found creative ways to excuse itself from its own stated principles, but the principles were articulated, argued over, printed in newspapers, performed on stages. They were part of the living fabric of the culture, in a way that he could not pretend he had not noticed. He also studied. This was, after all, the professional purpose of his posting, and Homma was not a man who allowed private intellectual pleasures to crowd out his professional responsibilities. He attended exercises, observed training formations, reviewed what the British had written about their own operational experience in the recently concluded war. He studied the mechanics of command, how orders moved through a hierarchy, how intelligence was gathered and assessed and acted upon, how a staff functioned under the pressure of events that moved faster than anyone had anticipated. He was a careful note-taker in every sense of the word, and the picture he assembled of the British military system was more nuanced and more admiring than the picture most of his contemporaries in Tokyo would have thought worth assembling. The years in Britain also allowed him to observe, at closer range than most Japanese officers ever managed, the political aftermath of total war. The negotiations and realignments of the early 1920s were not abstract diplomatic events to a man living in London and reading English daily. He watched the debate about what obligations the great powers owed each other, what limits should govern military action between nations, what the war had cost, and whether anyone in authority was prepared to think seriously about preventing the next one. He did not come away from this with any simple political conclusions, but he came away with a seriousness about these questions that most of the men he would later serve alongside did not share, and that seriousness would eventually put him at odds with forces inside his own institution, far more implacable than anything he encountered in London. When the posting ended and Homma returned to Japan, he was not the same officer who had departed. He was broader, more layered, more aware of the complexity of the world beyond the home islands, and quietly, privately, more aware of the gap between what the Japanese military told itself it was and what it was in the process of becoming. He brought back English books. He brought back friendships conducted by correspondence. He brought back a habit of thought that prized evidence and reflection over assertion and sentiment, a habit that would serve him in some contexts and fail him badly in others. And he brought back something harder to define, a kind of internal dividedness, a man who now carried two worlds inside him without a clear way to reconcile them, who had seen enough of Western civilization to admire it, and enough of its contradictions to resist being simply seduced by it. This quality, the cosmopolitanism, the literary sensibility, the refusal to be simply a soldier in the narrow sense, would attract suspicion in the years ahead. The Imperial Japanese Army of the 1930s was not a comfortable institution for officers who quoted English poetry or maintained Western friendships, or demonstrated, through the texture of their thinking, that they had been genuinely shaped by something outside the Japanese military tradition. The hardline factions consolidating power within the army during that decade had very specific ideas about what a Japanese officer should be, and Homma's particular combination of qualities did not match those ideas. He was too cosmopolitan. He was too thoughtful. He was, in the vocabulary the ultra-nationalists preferred, not sufficiently Japanese in the ways that counted. But all of that lay ahead of him as his ship carried him home across the waters from Britain. In those crossing days, before the factions and the purges and the impossible assignments, he was still the promising officer who had gone to London and returned having understood something real about the world. He had sat in the stalls of West End theatres and watched the British tell stories about themselves. He had walked streets still marked by a war whose lessons the world was already half forgetting. He had read and written and listened and thought and made the kind of connections with other human beings across cultural distance that a man makes only when he has genuinely tried to meet the world on its own terms. He carried all of it back with him, packed alongside his books and his notes and his letters of correspondence, a richer and more conflicted mind, returning to a country that was moving, with tremendous force and very little ambiguity, in the opposite direction entirely. He came home to a Japan that was accelerating, the quiet island of his birth, the measured libraries of the academy, the fog-softened parks of London. All of it receded as Homma stepped back into an institution in motion, an army remaking itself with urgent, sometimes violent purpose. Japan in the late 1920s was not the Japan he had left. The economy was fracturing under global pressures. Political assassinations were becoming a feature of public life, and inside the military, ambition had begun to curdle into something harder and less forgiving. The Imperial Japanese Army was no longer simply a professional body of officers rising through merit and service. It was becoming a battlefield of its own, where ideology competed with competence, and loyalty to faction sometimes mattered more than loyalty to the emperor or the nation. Homma read this landscape with the same careful attention he had brought to everything else in his career, and what he saw, one senses, did not entirely please him. His professional ascent through this period was, by any objective measure, impressive. He moved through staff appointments and regimental commands with the kind of quiet, accumulating authority that marks a man other serious officers take seriously. In the staff colleges and planning rooms of the Imperial Army, where the machinery of future campaigns was being sketched and revised, Homma was considered a first-rate mind. He could read a strategic problem from multiple angles, account for logistics where others reached only for glory, and communicate his assessments in clear, structured terms that cut through the noise of institutional politics. His time in Britain had sharpened something in him, a habit of measured analysis, a preference for getting the numbers right before committing the men. Other officers could smell the Western influence in his thinking, and some of them considered it a virtue. Others did not. What made Homma genuinely exceptional within the army of this era was not merely his tactical and administrative competence, but the breadth he carried into every room he entered. He continued to write poetry in these years, continued to read widely, continued to hold an interior life that extended well beyond the parade ground and the operations map. For the culture of the Imperial Army, at its most doctrinaire, this was suspect. The institution had always maintained a certain reverence for the warrior who subordinated everything, emotion, doubt, civilian sentiment, to the demands of duty and combat effectiveness. A general who composed verse, who had attended London theatre, who could discuss European literature with genuine enthusiasm, did not fit cleanly inside that ideal. He fit, but he sat at an angle, and angles attract friction. The factionalism that was tearing through the officer corps during these years had deep roots and sharper teeth than most armies in peacetime could sustain. Two broad tendencies had crystallized within the Imperial Army, and while the full political complexity defied simple summary, the essential tension was this. One faction sought to remold Japan's military and political institutions through internal revolution, and another leaned more toward conventional institutional authority. Neither tendency was without its own internal contradictions and competing personalities, but both expected officers of standing to declare themselves. Homma declined to declare himself. He had spent too long observing how institutions actually functioned. In Britain, in Japan, in the planning rooms where abstract ideology met the hard arithmetic of supply and manpower, to place his confidence in any faction that seemed to value purity of belief over quality of execution. It was a principled position. It was also, within the army of the 1930s, a dangerous one. Promotion continued nonetheless, because the professional record was simply too strong to be buried entirely. The army needed men who could plan, men who could administer, men who could be trusted to take a complex brief and return with something workable. Homma was that man, and the institution, whatever its internal politics, was not yet so consumed by faction that it could afford to waste him. He received commands, wrote assessments that circulated at senior levels, and was trusted with work that shaped how the army prepared for contingencies it was increasingly serious about pursuing. But the warmth that might have accompanied such recognition, the inclusion in inner councils, the easy camaraderie of officers who shared a worldview, was largely absent. He was used. He was respected in the professional sense. He was not, in the way that truly mattered inside that particular world, entirely trusted. The ultranationalist cliques that were gaining strength through the early 1930s had a specific way of measuring an officer's reliability, and by their metrics, Homma failed on multiple counts. He had spent years in Britain, absorbing a culture they considered decadent and corrosive. He demonstrated sympathy for civilian perspectives in ways that struck true believers as soft. He did not perform the rituals of factional loyalty that would have signaled his alignment, did not surround himself with the right subordinates, did not make the right enemies publicly enough to establish his credentials among men who valued passionate commitment above careful judgment. In a military culture, increasingly captured by the idea that will alone could overcome material and logistical deficiency, Homma's insistence on thinking carefully before acting looked, to certain eyes, like hesitation dressed as wisdom. There were episodes during these years, specific moments of institutional turbulence that tested every senior officer's footing, when extremist elements within the army moved against officers they considered obstacles. Those without factional protection found themselves vulnerable. Homma was not destroyed in these convulsions. but he was watched, and the watching left marks. The men who would one day have the power to assign him a mission, to hand him a timetable, to judge his performance and determine his fate. Some of those men were accumulating opinions about Homma in these years. They noted his competence with a kind of cool, impersonal acknowledgement that withheld enthusiasm. They noted his independence with something closer to suspicion. Files grow slowly in bureaucracies, but they grow. His domestic life during this period offered a counterpoint to the institutional pressures gathering around him. Homma was by all accounts a man of genuine warmth within the private sphere, a quality that seems almost startling set against the hard face the imperial army projected to the world. He read, he wrote, he maintained the interior dimensions of a life that the army's most doctrinaire voices would have told him to discard. Whether this private cultivation gave him strength or simply deepened the gap between himself and the institution he served is a question without a clean answer. Perhaps it was both. The man who emerged from this period into the higher commands of the late 1930s was not softened by his cultivation, but he was complicated by it in ways that the simplest version of military glory could never have produced. What was perhaps most quietly consequential about Homma's navigation of this era was what it cost him in terms of political capital, a currency that in the imperial army of the 1930s was often worth more than operational skill. The men who rose fastest in this period were frequently men who had attached themselves to a faction early and ridden its momentum, men who had demonstrated ideological reliability in the form that the most powerful cliques demanded. Homma had done none of this, and the price was paid not in immediate demotion or disgrace, but in something subtler and ultimately more damaging, the slow accumulation of institutional indifference toward his welfare. When hard decisions came, and in the years ahead they would come quickly, there would be few powerful voices inclined to protect him. He continued to be assigned to work of genuine importance, and he continued to perform it well. The contradiction at the heart of his late 1930s career was precisely this. He was good enough to be needed and independent enough to be resented. The army took what it required from him and offered in return the formal recognitions that a professional record of his caliber demanded, while withholding the deeper institutional loyalty that might have shielded him from what was to come. It was an arrangement that suited the institution and quietly hollowed out Homma's position within it, even as the epaulets accumulated and the commands grew larger. By the time Japan stood on the edge of its great southward offensive, the audacious strategic gamble that would send armies and fleets across a vast arc of ocean and jungle, Homma Masaharu was a general of genuine accomplishment and genuine isolation. His name was known, his record was respected, and his independence had made him precisely the kind of officer the army's hardest men thought it could afford to use without entirely valuing. He had spent more than a decade building a career inside an institution that was, in critical ways, moving away from everything he represented. He had watched colleagues align themselves with movements he considered reckless, had seen the machinery of ambition corrode into something uglier than ambition, and had chosen, again and again, the lonely discipline of his own judgment. It was a choice that would shape every decision and every failure of the years ahead, and it would follow him all the way to Manila. China was not what Masaharu Homma had studied. It was not the orderly campaigns mapped on staff college tables, not the clean geometry of fronts and flanks that European military theory preferred. It was vast and absorbing and morally corrosive in ways that no posting abroad, no season at a London theatre, no volume of Western philosophy had prepared him to navigate. When Homma arrived to take meaningful command responsibilities within the grinding machinery of the Second Sino-Japanese War, he stepped into a conflict that had already consumed enormous quantities of Japanese blood and pride, without producing anything resembling a decisive conclusion. China simply kept fighting. Cities fell and the war continued. Armies were routed and the war continued. Japan had expected conquest and received instead a swamp, and men like Homma were the ones sent to drain it. He arrived with his discipline intact, his convictions about professional soldiering carefully maintained, and a private moral vocabulary forged partly in the lecture halls of Japan and partly in the civilized drawing rooms of Britain. The question China would pose to him was whether any of that would survive contact with what he was about to see. The scale of the conflict dwarfed anything in his previous experience. He had held staff positions, he had administered, he had planned, but commanding men in combat at scale, moving brigades and divisions through contested terrain against an enemy who refused to behave as doctrine predicted, was a different discipline entirely. China demanded improvisation and endurance in roughly equal measure, and the officers who thrived there were often those willing to dispense with restraint in pursuit of results. Villages that sheltered resistance became targets. Populations that could not be distinguished from combatants were treated as combatants by the bluntest and most expedient interpretation of military necessity. The Imperial Japanese Army in China was not a monolithic institution. It contained officers of genuine professionalism, alongside men whose conduct would have appalled any serious reading of the laws of war. Homma observed all of it. He understood from early in his command responsibilities that the war he was being asked to fight bore almost no resemblance to the war he had trained to fight. What distinguished him in the eyes of his subordinates, and what would eventually mark him as a problem in the eyes of certain superiors, was a consistent demand for discipline in the treatment of civilians and prisoners. This was not, in 1930s China, an unremarkable or straightforward position. The prevailing attitude in significant portions of the Imperial Japanese Army treated severity toward the civilian population as a tactical instrument, a means of breaking the will of the enemy and eliminating the ambiguous middle ground of populations who might feed, shelter, or inform the resistance. Homma rejected this calculus, not loudly, not in the language of protest, but in the practical language of orders issued and expectations set for the units under his authority. He demanded accountability from his officers. He expected that civilians be treated according to the standards that a professional army was supposed to maintain. Among the men who served directly under him, this created a reputation for seriousness and a kind of moral rigor that some found admirable and others found impractical to the point of absurdity. The tensions this created were not theoretical. In a war fought largely through the pacification of vast rural territories, where the line between armed resistance and civilian life was permanently blurred, Homma's insistence on restraint put him in recurring friction with commanders who measured success in simpler and cruder terms. There were those above him and beside him in the hierarchy who regarded any hesitation to apply maximum force as a form of sentimentality, an officer's personal squeamishness dressed up in the language of military professionalism. The whispers that had begun to gather around him during the factional struggles of the earlier decade, that he was too Western, too contemplative, insufficiently hardened for the demands of empire, found fresh material in China. He was winning no admirers among the hardliners by conducting himself as though the rules of engagement were a genuine obligation rather than a polite fiction. He also confronted in China the particular demoralization that a protracted counterinsurgency imposes on any army. The men under his command were not fighting toward a visible end. They were maintaining occupation, suppressing resistance, garrisoning territory that was simultaneously held and contested, and doing so in a country whose geography and population density made total control a permanent illusion. Soldiers who had enlisted for a war of swift imperial expansion found themselves instead in something closer to an endless and directionless grinding. The psychological toll of that gap between expectation and reality expressed itself in ways that Homma had to manage without the luxury of being able to explain to his own men, let alone to Tokyo, why the war was not going the way it was supposed to go. He was an effective commander within an ineffective strategic situation, and he knew it. His experience in China also gave him a deepened understanding of logistics and administration, perhaps the most unsexy and most critical dimension of sustained military operations. The failures he witnessed, units running short of food and medical supplies, prisoner handling, conducted with no planning, and catastrophic results. The consistent gap between what the army claimed it could do and what it could actually sustain left clear impressions. He was a careful enough observer to recognize that armies do not fail only in battle. They fail in the maintenance of order, in the management of the populations they encounter, in the 1,000 administrative decisions that generals make, or neglect to make, and that determine whether a campaign is conducted with any semblance of professional control. He filed these observations in whatever part of himself still believed that the lessons of one war could be applied to the next. There was something else China gave him that is harder to name, a tested and sobered understanding of his own position within the institution he served. He was not naive enough by this point in his career to believe that competence alone determined an officer's trajectory. The Imperial Japanese Army of the 1930s was a place where factional loyalty, ideological conformity, and aggressive nationalism were the currencies that bought advancement and protection. Homma spent none of those currencies willingly. He served professionally. He commanded with discipline. He produced results measured in military terms, and he watched as men of inferior professional ability but superior factional connection accumulated the influence and the favor that would eventually shape the structure of the entire war effort. China clarified his isolation in ways that earlier postings had only suggested. It would be too simple to portray him as a man of pure conscience, operating in a corrupt system. He was part of the apparatus of an imperial war that China had not invited and did not want. And whatever the conduct he imposed upon the units under his authority, those units were instruments of an occupation defined by violence, displacement, and suffering at a scale that individual commanders could moderate but not alter. Demanding restraint from the men beneath him did not transform what the war itself was doing to the country it was consuming. Homma understood institutions well enough to know that an officer's ethical preferences set the ceiling of conduct in his immediate sphere and nothing beyond it. He had influence over what he commanded, and almost none over what the war, as a whole, was becoming. The years in China did something else that is worth noting carefully. They built his command credentials in a way that made him, on paper, a logical choice for large-scale operational command in the next phase of Japan's expansion. He had demonstrated the ability to manage complex, multi-unit operations in difficult terrain against a resilient enemy. He had shown competence in the administrative dimension of sustained campaigning. He had not disgraced himself or his formations. In the cold currency of military evaluation, he was a proven senior commander, and the army, regardless of its private contempt for his politics and temperament, knew how to use proven senior commanders when the moment required them. China had made him more formidable professionally, even as it had narrowed his prospects politically, and the combination of those two things, elevated capability diminished standing, would define exactly what kind of mission he would eventually be handed. When he thought about China in the quieter moments that even wartime commanders occasionally find, it is reasonable to believe that what returned to him was not the maps or the operational summaries, but the faces. The civilian populations caught in an occupation they had no power to escape. The soldiers under his command, maintaining their discipline because he had demanded it, and some of them may genuinely have believed in it, and the other commanders, the ones who looked at his standards and saw only weakness, who would outlast him in the hierarchy and shape the army's character in ways he could not prevent. He had walked through China with his convictions more or less intact, which was no small achievement. But intact convictions in a war that did not share them are a kind of private victory that costs everything and changes nothing. He returned from China a more complete soldier and a more isolated one, carrying the weight of what he had seen without the comfort of believing that what he had demanded from his men had been enough to matter, or that the army he served had any particular interest in the kind of officer he had chosen to be. The posting had tested him. He had not broken, but the institution around him had registered his refusals and his hesitations and his Western sensibilities and his inconvenient conscience, and it had made its own quiet assessment. When the great southward offensive began to take shape in the latter months of 1941, and when the assignment of a lifetime landed on the desk of a man who had spent years being both valued and quietly resented, China was the soil in which all of that had grown. By the autumn of 1941, the machinery of Japanese imperial ambition was turning at a speed that left little room for doubt or dissent. The war in China had consumed years and hundreds of thousands of lives. Without producing the decisive resolution Tokyo had promised the Japanese people. The economy was straining under the weight of that conflict, and the resource lines that fed modern industrial warfare, oil, rubber, iron, were growing dangerously thin. American sanctions, tightened progressively through that year, had placed Japan in a strategic position that the hardliners in government and the military chose to read not as a warning, but as a provocation. The southward advance, long debated in staff rooms and war colleges, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was becoming a schedule. The strategic logic, as Imperial General Headquarters framed it, was a kind of brutal coherence. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice and resources of Southeast Asia. These could sustain a Japanese empire that would no longer be dependent on the goodwill of Western powers. But to reach them, Japan needed to neutralize the threats on its flanks. The American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii represented one such threat. The American military presence in the Philippine Islands represented another. Sitting astride the sea lanes between Japan and the southern resource zones, the Philippines could not simply be bypassed. They had to be taken, and taken quickly, before American power could be consolidated and reinforced. The timetable being drafted in Tokyo carried within it an almost religious confidence in Japanese military superiority, a confidence that had been fed by a decade of victories in China and by the racial assumptions that underpinned so much of the empire's strategic thinking. Into this atmosphere of accelerating momentum and dangerous optimism, Masaharu Homma received his orders. He was to command the 14th Army and lead the conquest of the Philippine Islands. By the autumn of 1941, Homma was a general of considerable experience and real ability, a man who had served in China, risen through staff positions, and accumulated the professional credentials that marked him as one of the Imperial Army's more capable senior commanders. He was also, by the standards of the institution he served, a man regarded with a degree of suspicion. His years in Britain, his fondness for Western literature and theatre, his reputation for restraint in China. These were not qualities that made him beloved by the ultra-nationalist faction that was increasingly setting the cultural tone of the imperial army. The assignment to the Philippines, on its surface a mark of professional trust, carried within it a complicated freight of institutional politics. Those who knew Homma well during that period later described his reception of the assignment as notably lacking in the enthusiasm that Tokyo would have preferred to see. There was no record of the triumphant general, eager to deliver his emperor a swift and glorious conquest. By the accounts that survived the war, Homma accepted his orders with the composure of a professional soldier, but privately, he questioned from the outset the assumptions on which the entire plan rested. He had spent years learning to read military problems with sober analytical honesty, and the more he examined the Philippine campaign as it had been structured for him, the more the plan's optimism appeared to him as a form of institutional wishful thinking pressed into the shape of operational orders. The force assigned to him was substantial on paper. The 14th Army comprised 2 divisions as its core striking force, along with supporting armored units, artillery, engineer battalions, and the air assets of the 5th Air Force. These were experienced troops, many of them veterans of the China campaigns, equipped and trained to a high standard by the measures of the time. Naval support had been allocated for the amphibious phases of the operation, and yet Homma could read the arithmetic in front of him with the clarity that his years of military education had given him, and the arithmetic was troubling. The Philippine Islands were not a single objective, but an archipelago of more than 7,000 individual islands, with the main island of Luzon alone spanning a territory of considerable geographic complexity, mountain ranges, river systems, dense jungle, and coastal plains that could be defended by a determined enemy with knowledge of the ground. The defending forces, as Japanese intelligence assessed them, were a mixed picture. The United States Army forces in the Far East, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, included American Regular Army and National Guard units, and a larger force of Philippine Army soldiers who had been mobilizing throughout 1941 under a program of rapid expansion that had outrun the supply of trained officers, adequate equipment, and time for coherent unit formation. On paper, MacArthur's command numbered in the tens of thousands. In practical combat effectiveness, the assessments varied sharply, and Japanese planners who chose to dismiss the Filipino soldiers as negligible opponents were making an error that Homma, with his more cautious analytical temperament, was perhaps less inclined to make than some of his superiors. A poorly equipped army, defending its own soil with knowledge of its own terrain, was not the same as a poorly equipped army in the open field. The timetable handed to Homma specified that the campaign should be completed in roughly 50 days. 50 days to land on a defended archipelago, defeat the opposing forces in the field, capture Manila, and bring organized resistance to an end. The figure had been derived partly by analogy. The Malayan campaign was expected to move with comparable speed, and partly by the kind of institutional self-assurance that had come to treat Japanese military superiority as a fixed constant rather than a variable that enemy resistance could disrupt. Homma reportedly raised objections, or at minimum, communicated reservations through appropriate channels, suggesting that the timetable was more aspiration than realistic planning. Those reservations were not well received. Tokyo was not, at that moment, in the business of entertaining the doubts of subordinate commanders about schedules that had already been endorsed at the highest levels of the military and the government. What made the timetable particularly dangerous was not simply that it was aggressive. Aggressive timetables had been used effectively in other campaigns, but that it carried logistical consequences that would reverberate far beyond the battlefield. If the campaign was expected to last 50 days, then the supplies allocated for prisoners of war, for the administration of captured territory, for the management of a population under occupation, would be calibrated accordingly. Medical provisions, food stocks, transportation assets, administrative personnel, all of these would be sized to a 50-day campaign. If the campaign lasted significantly longer, every one of those calculations would be wrong, and the shortfalls would be borne not only by Homma's fighting divisions, but by every human being caught in the machinery of the occupation. This was not a theoretical concern. It was a structural vulnerability built into the plan before a single Japanese soldier had set foot on Philippine soil. Homma was also aware of the context in which his campaign sat within the broader Japanese strategic offensive. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces were preparing to strike simultaneously at multiple targets: Pearl Harbor, Malaya, Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam. The entire southern operation was conceived as a coordinated blow, a series of short, sharp campaigns that would collectively establish a defensive perimeter broad enough to make American reconquest prohibitively costly. In that context, the Philippine campaign was not merely one operation among many. It was a critical piece in a strategic puzzle, and its completion on time was linked, in the minds of Japanese planners, to the maintenance of momentum across the entire theater. Any delay in the Philippines would not simply embarrass the officer responsible. It would create operational problems that rippled outward through the whole architecture of Japanese grand strategy. In late 1941, none of that had yet happened. The war was still a plan on paper, a series of arrows drawn across maps in staff rooms in Tokyo. For Homma, the weeks before the campaign opened were spent on the work that he knew how to do: studying terrain maps, reviewing unit readiness assessments, coordinating with naval and air commanders, rehearsing the logistics of the amphibious landings. He was, by every professional measure, doing his job. But beneath the professionalism, by the accounts of those who observed him during that period, there ran a current of unease that he carried quietly, privately, in the way of a man who has been handed a task he did not choose and given tools he does not consider adequate for the work being asked of him. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A general preparing to launch one of the largest amphibious operations in the Pacific War's opening phase, surrounded by his staff, surrounded by the organized apparatus of military planning, and carrying within him the private knowledge that the assumptions underpinning his orders were fragile. He could not refuse. The institutional logic of the Imperial Army did not accommodate refusal from a general who had not yet been given the chance to fail. He could not redesign the timetable unilaterally, could not demand more resources than Tokyo was willing to allocate, could not reshape the strategic expectations that had been locked in place by men far above his rank. What he could do was execute the orders he had been given and hope that reality cooperated more generously with the plan than his instincts told him it would. His instincts, as events would prove, were correct. The reality would not cooperate at all. The 8th of December, 1941, in the Western Pacific time zone, was coming. Across the Philippine Islands, American and Filipino soldiers, who did not yet know what was about to fall on them, were sleeping, eating, writing letters, living the last quiet hours before the world changed around them. And in his headquarters, Masaharu Homma, the cosmopolitan general who had read Shakespeare in London and written poetry in quiet moments of reflection, was preparing to send his army into an archipelago he had never wanted to conquer, on a schedule he had never believed in, for an empire that had never entirely trusted him. The burden he was carrying into that campaign was not only military, It was the weight of a man performing a role that history had assigned him without asking whether he was willing to play it. The world learned of Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, but in the Philippine Islands, the war had already arrived. On the other side of the international date line, dawn was breaking over Manila Bay when the radio stations broadcasting from Hawaii reported the catastrophe. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces in the Far East, received the news in the early morning hours of the 8th of December. He had mere hours to absorb the reality that America was at war, that the Japanese Empire was moving, and that his territory, an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands stretching across the Western Pacific, was precisely where the enemy wanted to strike. The surprise was complete, though not quite in the way it had been at Pearl Harbor. MacArthur and his staff had been expecting Japanese action in the Philippines. What they had not counted on was how swiftly and with what overwhelming force it would come. Within hours of receiving word of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese bombers appeared over the American airfields of Luzon in the Philippines, and the destruction they inflicted was systematic and thorough. The bases at Clark Field and Iba Field were caught in the early morning hours, their aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip, a vulnerability that had been noted and warned about by junior officers but had not been acted upon. The Japanese formations came out of the north, high and organized, and the American anti-aircraft defenses could do little to stop them. When the smoke cleared, dozens of American warplanes lay destroyed or burning on the tarmac, and the handful that had managed to get airborne could not turn the tide. The air superiority that might have contested the Japanese landings was gone in those first devastating hours, eliminated not in the fury of aerial combat, but through the systematic destruction of machines on the ground. American pilots who survived would spend years reflecting on those lost moments, on the difference between the wars they had been prepared to fight and the war they were actually facing. This catastrophe in the air was not accidental. Masaharu Homma, commanding the 14th Army from his headquarters on Taiwan, had planned precisely for this scenario. The destruction of American air power was meant to be the prelude to everything that followed, and it succeeded utterly. By the 9th of December, the Japanese possessed what amounted to free rein over the Philippine skies. American naval forces in the islands were either destroyed, damaged, or had begun their withdrawal southward toward Java. General MacArthur, still trying to establish his command in the chaos of the opening hours, began to contemplate a military situation that was deteriorating by the hour. The grand strategy that had been drafted and discussed in American war rooms, the defense of the Philippines as a bastion of American power in Asia, was already collapsing before the first major ground engagement. The Japanese landings began within days of the airstrikes, executed with a precision that suggested Homma's planning had been thorough and his forces were well trained. The main assault came at the north of Luzon, at a place called Lingayen Gulf, where the 14th Army poured ashore in waves. The defending American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Jonathan Wainwright and other senior officers, were scattered across Luzon in defensive positions designed for a war that was already becoming obsolete. The initial Japanese landings at Lingayen were not opposed with anything approaching the force that might have been available had American air superiority and naval forces still been intact. What resistance did materialize came from scattered Filipino units and small numbers of American troops, brave but insufficient, unable to stop the Japanese flow ashore or to concentrate effectively against an enemy that could land where it chose and move where it wished. Within hours, the bridgehead was secure. Within days, it was expanding rapidly southward toward Manila. What made the situation even more desperate for the defenders was the nature of Homma's strategy. Rather than commit his entire force to a single, concentrated advance, Homma ordered secondary landings at multiple points around Luzon, on the west coast, in the south, in locations designed to stretch the defending forces even thinner and to create the possibility of cutting them off from retreat. The American and Filipino commanders were confronted with an enemy that was landing everywhere at once, and with the loss of air superiority and naval support, there was simply no way to concentrate sufficient force to stop all of these landings simultaneously. The nightmare scenario that military planners fear was unfolding in real time. The defender was being forced to be weak everywhere because the attacker could strike anywhere. Japanese landing craft, moving under cover of air superiority and with no meaningful naval opposition, were delivering thousands upon thousands of combat troops to beaches and bays across the northern and western portions of Luzon. By the 10th of December, the strategic situation facing MacArthur and his command had shifted from bad to untenable. The original plan for the defense of the Philippines, designated War Plan Orange, and later modified as the Rainbow 5 variant, had contemplated holding the islands long enough for the American fleet to arrive from Pearl Harbor and relieve the siege. But the American fleet was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. No relief was coming. The Philippines could not be held with the forces available, and that reality, however bitter, had to be confronted immediately. MacArthur convened his senior commanders to discuss the only alternative that remained: withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula, a finger of land jutting into Manila Bay that offered some natural defensive advantages and the possibility of holding out long enough for what? Exactly. No one quite said. The American garrison would have to trust that some mechanism of rescue or relief would eventually materialize. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only hope remaining. The decision to withdraw was made, but executing a withdrawal in the face of an enemy that possessed air superiority and numerical advantage was itself a profoundly difficult military operation. The units that had been scattered across Luzon had to be collected, organized, and moved toward Manila, and then across the beaches onto the Bataan Peninsula, all while being pursued by Japanese forces that were moving with speed and confidence. The roads quickly became choked with American and Filipino soldiers, refugees, and the endless train of supplies and equipment that armies accumulate. Japanese aircraft harassed the columns from above, and the Japanese ground forces pushed relentlessly forward, trying to encircle and cut off the withdrawing Americans before they could escape to the peninsula. It was a running fight across the landscape of Luzon, a gradual compression toward the narrow strip of land that was the only remaining option. Manila itself lay in the path of the Japanese advance, and MacArthur made a decision that was, in his own view, both militarily sound and strategically necessary. He declared the city an open city, which meant that it was undefended and should not be contested militarily. All American and Filipino military forces were ordered to evacuate toward Bataan, leaving the city to the Japanese. The civilians of Manila faced an uncertain future, not knowing what occupation would bring, and many packed what they could carry and joined the exodus or attempted to hide themselves in a city that was about to come under enemy control. The historical record of this moment is complicated by what would follow. The city would eventually be destroyed during the final American reconquest in 1945, killing hundreds of thousands. But at this moment, in December of 1941, MacArthur's decision to abandon the city and save his army seemed like the only rational choice. The alternative would have been to fight street by street through Manila, a battle that would destroy the city with certainty and would sacrifice the American army for a city that could not be held. By any military calculus, the withdrawal was correct. Homma, directing the campaign from his command post, watched this unfolding with satisfaction. The Americans were doing exactly what he wanted them to do. They were retreating. The speed of the Japanese advance and the collapse of American resistance were confirming what Japanese planners had expected, that once air superiority was secured and the initial landings were established, the Americans would have no choice but to give ground. The Japanese military culture of the time was one in which an enemy that retreated was an enemy that was defeated. Once you had them on the back foot, victory was inevitable. The capturing of Manila seemed certain, and with the capital city in Japanese hands, the war in the Philippines would effectively be over. That was the assumption. That was the belief driving the 14th Army forward. That assumption was about to collide catastrophically with the reality of what awaited on the Bataan Peninsula. The American and Filipino forces that successfully extracted themselves from the collapsing positions across Luzon and made their way across the narrow causeway onto the Bataan Peninsula arrived battered, exhausted, and with far fewer men and supplies than military planning had assumed would be available. But they arrived. The units formed up along a line stretching across the peninsula from east to west, and they prepared to make a stand. General Jonathan Wainwright and his subordinate commanders looked at the terrain, rough, jungle-covered, with limited road networks and difficult approaches, and began to see something that the Japanese did not yet understand. The Bataan Peninsula, though small, was defensible. It was not going to be the grand American bastion that planners in Washington had dreamed of, but it could, with discipline and courage, be held longer than anyone in Tokyo expected. As December gave way to January, the Japanese advance began to slow as it encountered the first serious resistance it had met since arriving in the Philippines. What was supposed to be a 50-day conquest of the islands was already beginning to run behind schedule. The withdrawal to Bataan represented, in many ways, a transformation of the strategic problem. The American and Filipino forces had lost the ability to defend the entire archipelago. They had lost Manila. They had lost air superiority and naval support. But in concentrating their remaining forces on a single peninsula with defined borders, they had created a military problem that was far more difficult than it appeared. Homma's original timetable, which had depended on the Americans either fighting a losing war of maneuver across the entire island of Luzon or simply collapsing when Manila fell, was now in jeopardy. The Japanese commander had been given 50 days to conquer the Philippines. He had secured all the major objectives and inflicted what he believed would be decisive defeats. But on the Bataan Peninsula, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were preparing to fight, and the easy victory that Tokyo had anticipated was beginning to look considerably less certain. The landings in the dark had been successful, the advance had been rapid, and Manila was falling. But somewhere in the early weeks of January 1942, Masaharu Homma was beginning to realize that his true ordeal was only beginning. The plan was straightforward in Tokyo's estimation. General Masaharu Homma would land on Luzon, sweep aside the defenders with overwhelming force, and be finished within 50 days. The timetable had been set by men sitting in comfortable offices far from the Philippine heat, men who had studied the American garrison on paper and concluded that organized resistance would evaporate under sustained pressure. What Tokyo did not fully account for was the human capacity to resist when retreat becomes impossible, and the geography of Bataan itself, a narrow, jungle-choked peninsula that jutted into Manila Bay like a human fist, all dense vegetation and ravines and broken terrain that converted American defensive weakness into unexpected advantage. Within days of the initial landings, it became clear to Homma that his calendar was already failing. The American commander facing Homma was General Douglas MacArthur, though that fact would soon become more complicated than it appeared. When the Japanese landings began in early December of 1941, MacArthur had been stationed in the Philippines for several years, commanding American forces in the far Pacific Theater. He had no air superiority. The Japanese strikes on Clark Field and other airfields had devastated American aviation on the ground, and his ground forces were a mixture of regular army, National Guard, Philippine Scouts, and Filipino conscripts of variable training and equipment. The position was untenable as a forward defense, and MacArthur, working from plans that had been drawn up years earlier and then modified, made the crucial decision to declare Manila an open city and withdraw all combat forces to the Bataan Peninsula, a move that stunned American civilians in the capital and that would remain controversial for the rest of his life. That decision, however, would also buy time. The Bataan Peninsula lies southwest of Manila, across Manila Bay. It is roughly 90 kilometers long, and at its widest, perhaps 40 kilometers across. But much of that terrain is jungle, ravine, ridgeline, and dense tropical growth that makes movement extraordinarily difficult. The defending forces, under the overall command of General Jonathan Wainwright and various subordinate commanders responsible for different sectors, established defensive lines across the narrowest part of the peninsula, creating a fortified line that ran from Manila Bay on the east to the South China Sea on the west. The defenders had spent days and weeks preparing entrenchments, laying barbed wire, registering artillery, and positioning infantry in mutually supporting positions across the ridgeline that formed the peninsula's spine. By the time Homma's lead divisions began pressing toward this line in mid-December, the Americans and Filipinos had created something that looked on a map like actual military geography, not impregnable, but structured, prepared, and defended by soldiers with their backs to the sea and nowhere to retreat. What happened when the Japanese launched their first serious assault on this line astonished everyone. The Japanese forces, accustomed now to victory and confident in their superior training, attacking in division strength with artillery support, ran headlong into concentrated fire and discovered that American artillery and Filipino machine gunners, though poorly supplied and undermanned, could still make an attack extremely costly. Japanese units that had swept through the open terrain of northern Luzon found themselves pinned in broken country, unable to maneuver around entrenched positions, taking casualties that mounted by the hour. Homma, standing behind the lines, received reports of one failure after another. Units were repulsed. Assaults that should have broken through in hours were grinding into two-day affairs. The defenders were not supposed to hold. They were supposed to panic, break, and scatter, allowing the Japanese army to sweep them aside and consolidate the conquest. Instead, they were standing and fighting. The defenders themselves were aware that they were not supposed to survive this. The supplies on Bataan were finite. There had never been an intention to stock the peninsula for a long siege, and from the very beginning, rations were strict. American officers calculated that there was perhaps enough food for the garrison to eat full rations for a few weeks, and after that, the diet would contract drastically. There was no reinforcement coming from America. The United States Navy had been shattered at Pearl Harbor. American aircraft production, while eventually enormous, could not get planes to the Philippines in anything like sufficient numbers. Manila had fallen. Every objective military assessment said that Bataan would fall as well, probably within a matter of weeks. Yet the men dug in and fought. Filipino regiments whose conscripts had never seen combat before held their ground. American officers who had commanded in peacetime now directed warfare, and day after day, the line held. The reasons for the hold were multiple and reinforcing. First, the defenders had the advantage of prepared defensive positions. They could see the approaches, had time to prepare fields of fire, and could concentrate their limited firepower on the attacking Japanese columns, forced to advance across broken terrain. Second, the Japanese were hampered by their own supply difficulties. They had landed with the expectation of a brief, overwhelming campaign, and their logistical structure reflected that assumption. As the days stretched into weeks, and ammunition, food, and reinforcements became difficult to move south from newly captured northern Luzon, the Japanese attacks themselves began to weaken in intensity and coordination. Third, the defenders had the psychological advantage of fighting on prepared ground with their back to the sea. There was no retreat, and that absence of an escape route, terrible as it was, also meant they could not break and scatter. Surrender was always theoretically possible, but it was not yet inevitable, and in those circumstances, a professional soldier often keeps fighting. For Homma, each day that the line held was a day closer to catastrophe. Tokyo had not given him merely a strategic objective, the conquest of the Philippines, but had tied that objective to a timetable. 50 days. That was the number that had been set, the number that had been communicated to other commanders and to the government, the number that was now, by early January of 1942, already slipping beyond reach. He began requesting reinforcements from Tokyo, arguing that the resistance was stronger than expected and that additional divisions would be necessary to break the stalemate. In Tokyo, there was disbelief. The Philippine garrison was supposed to be an easy victory, a demonstration of Japanese military prowess. That it was becoming anything but. That was an embarrassment that was difficult to acknowledge to the civilian government or to the emperor. Yet the facts were undeniable. Homma's forces were stalled on Bataan, casualties were mounting, and the calendar was running out. The fighting throughout January and into February of 1942 continued with intensity, but also with a grinding, exhausting monotony that wore on both sides. Japanese forces would mass for an assault, attack in waves across difficult terrain, be repulsed by American or Filipino defenders who had seen them coming, and then fall back. The next day, after reorganization, they would try again, sometimes in a different location, sometimes in greater force. The defenders would hold if they could, and sometimes they could not. Sections of the line would be pushed back by the weight of numbers or by successful flanking movements through the jungle. But each time the line bent, it did not break. Fresh defensive positions would be established a few kilometers farther back, and the resistance would continue. American artillery, though running low on ammunition, was husbanded carefully and employed with devastating effect on the massed Japanese formations. Machine guns that had come from 1920s and 1930s era manufacture still fired with lethal accuracy. Filipino soldiers who had been conscripts weeks before found in themselves the capacity to endure and to kill. By late February, the situation on Bataan had become a siege in all but name. The Japanese held the peninsula's interior, but could not crack the defensive lines. The Americans and Filipinos held their lines, but could not push back. Food on the Bataan side was becoming critically short. Rations had been cut repeatedly, and men were working on quarter rations, half rations, less. Malaria had begun to spread through the defenders with devastating effect. There was little medicine, little quinine, little of anything to combat the disease. Dysentery and other illnesses born of poor sanitation and tropical conditions swept through the ranks. Wounded men who might have been evacuated or properly treated lay on stretchers in field hospitals that had almost no morphine, almost no antibiotics, almost no medical supplies of consequence. The men of Bataan were wasting away on battlefields that were becoming increasingly a struggle between the defenders and disease, as much as between the defenders and the Japanese army. Yet still the line held. It held in February, into March, and into April. The defenders would later say that they did it because they were professional soldiers, and soldiers hold lines. They did it because their officers held, and officers who hold inspire enlisted men to hold. They did it because the alternative, immediate surrender, seemed unthinkable to men who had been taught that their duty was to fight. And they did it, perhaps, for something more profound than military discipline. The simple human fact that when you are asked to hold a line, when that line is the only thing between an advancing army and your comrades and your country, many men will hold that line for as long as their bodies have the capacity to do so, regardless of how hopeless the situation appears on paper. For Homma, the situation had become personally dire. His career, his reputation in Tokyo, his very standing as a senior commander, now depended on breaking through a line that refused to break on schedule. He was receiving increasingly sharp communications from Imperial General Headquarters, communiques that made clear his failure was being noticed and judged. Tokyo had sent additional divisions, but command authority over them had been distributed among other senior officers, rather than fully integrated under Homma's direct control, a barely concealed indication that confidence in his leadership was eroding. Reinforcements were coming, but slowly, and with each week of delay, Homma's humiliation grew. He had been handed an assignment to crush what Tokyo viewed as an inferior force in a remote colony, and he was failing to deliver. The Tiger of Malaya, as he would later be known, was discovering that tigers do not always devour their prey on the timetable imagined by observers watching from a distance. Yet for all of Homma's embarrassment and Tokyo's impatience, the simple fact remained. The line on Bataan held through March and into early April of 1942, not because of brilliant defensive strategy or overwhelming resources, but because desperate men fighting in prepared positions are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The Japanese attacks gradually intensified as reinforcements arrived in the Philippines and fresh divisions moved into position. The defenders grew weaker by the day as hunger, disease, and casualties accumulated. But the line held. It would not hold forever. Nothing held forever in the Second World War. But for those months from December through early April, American and Filipino soldiers, facing an army that had conquered Malaya and seemed unstoppable in Asia, somehow found the will and the means to say no. They could not win. They could not even hold indefinitely. But they held long enough to shatter the 50-day timetable, long enough to inflict serious casualties on a Japanese army that had believed itself invincible, and long enough to force their commander and the government in Tokyo to confront the fact that victory in the Pacific would be neither swift nor cheap. By the first days of February in 1942, General Masaharu Homma faced a crisis that no battlefield victory could have prevented. The Bataan Peninsula remained unconquered. Men who were supposed to have been broken and scattered within weeks were instead dug into defensive positions, fighting with a tenacity that had shattered the carefully calculated operational timeline that Tokyo had handed down like scripture. What should have been a 50-day conquest was now entering its third month, with no clear end visible through the smoke and disease and desperate rationing. Back in Tokyo, at Imperial General Headquarters, the patience that had never been abundant was now evaporating entirely. Homma was no longer simply a commander, executing a difficult campaign. He was becoming an embarrassment to the army and to the empire itself. The officers in the general staff who had championed him, or at least tolerated him, began to turn away or fall silent. Those who had always doubted his westernized sensibilities and his lack of ultra-nationalist fervor saw in the Bataan stalemate proof of their original suspicions, that Homma was not ruthless enough, not aggressive enough, not fully committed to the ideological purity that, in their view, should animate military genius. Tokyo's response was swift and, to Homma, unmistakable in its message. In mid-February, the army dispatched a succession of senior officers to the Philippines, men sent explicitly to oversee, inspect, and in practical terms, to assume control of aspects of the campaign that had previously fallen entirely under Homma's authority. These were not subordinates. They were emissaries from the throne room, sent to watch, to judge, and to manage the situation in ways that made it clear to every officer in Manila that Homma's confidence and autonomy were no longer absolute. The presence of these overseers created a fractured command structure that undermined Homma's ability to impose unified direction on his own army. Orders from Tokyo began to flow directly to specific units and commanders, bypassing Homma's staff and creating parallel chains of authority that existed nominally under the umbrella of his command, but operated in practice with considerable independence. This was not merely an inconvenience or an administrative complication. It was a public revelation that Homma had lost the trust of the institution he served. Every officer under his command understood that the general was being watched, questioned, and slowly stripped of effective control over his own army during the most critical phase of the entire campaign. Homma himself endured this humiliation with the outward composure expected of a Japanese general officer. But the psychological toll was catastrophic. He had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a careful, methodical administrator and strategist, a man whose strength lay not in battlefield brilliance, but in the orchestration of complex military operations and the maintenance of discipline and order. Now, in what should have been his moment of vindication, the conquest of an entire archipelago, he was instead being portrayed as inadequate, as a commander unequal to the task he had been given. The very qualities that had made him attractive to Tokyo in 1941, his sophistication, his Western education, his intellectual curiosity, were now being weaponized against him in whispered conversations in military clubs and staffed offices. Homma was too soft, they said. He had been too influenced by his years in Europe and America. He did not have the killer instinct necessary for the new order that Japan was building. These accusations were fundamentally at odds with the man's entire career, yet they circulated with the poisonous efficiency of institutional doubt. Homma confided to those few intimates he still trusted that the campaign had become, in a sense, poisoned before it had even begun. The impossible timetable imposed from Tokyo had ensured that no commander, no matter how brilliant or ruthless, could have met it. Yet now that it was clear the impossible could not be achieved, it was Homma who bore the full weight of failure. The arrival of fresh divisions from Japan was supposed to provide relief and momentum, but instead it became another instrument of pressure and reproach. These new formations were placed under the command of other senior officers, rather than being fully integrated into the 14th Army structure under Homma's direct authority. This meant that while Homma remained nominally the commander of the entire campaign, he was in fact overseeing a coalition of semi-independent commands that answered to Tokyo even as they coordinated with Homma's headquarters. The psychology of this arrangement was devastating. Officers who commanded these new formations understood that they were not subordinates of Homma in the traditional sense. They were alternative power centers whose success or failure would be measured independently. This created incentives for these commanders to pursue aggressive tactics, to take risks, to generate victories that could be reported back to Tokyo as justification for their operations. It also meant that the administrative nightmare that was beginning to form behind the lines, the questions of supply, logistics, prisoner handling, and the treatment of conquered populations, fell increasingly into the gaps between these fractured commands. No one was fully responsible because authority was shared in a way that diffused accountability while failing to produce coordination. It was during these weeks of early 1942, as Homma's authority was being steadily chipped away, that the foundations of what would later become the Bataan Death March were being laid through a combination of deliberate choices and systemic failures. The conquest of the Philippines was supposed to be a swift operation, almost a police action, against a militarily inferior opponent. The original Japanese plans had not included sophisticated preparations for the movement and administration of massive numbers of prisoners of war. Why would they? If the war was supposed to end in 50 days, the question of managing tens of thousands of captives would be someone else's problem, someone else's crisis, handled after the rapid conclusion by peacetime administrators in a conquered and pacified Philippines. But as the campaign dragged into February and March, with no clear endpoint in sight and pressure building from Tokyo, the question of what to do with captured American and Filipino soldiers became increasingly urgent. The facilities that did not exist were supposed to be improvised. The supply lines that had been calculated for a short campaign were supposed to suddenly be stretched to accommodate the feeding and housing of prisoners whose numbers would eventually reach the tens of thousands. Homma, his authority fragmenting under the weight of Tokyo's scrutiny and the presence of rival commanders, was in no position to impose order on this emerging chaos. In the midst of this institutional pressure and deteriorating command structure, Homma struggled to maintain any coherent strategic vision for the campaign. He was simultaneously defending his operational judgment to Tokyo, coordinating with rival commanders whose loyalty lay elsewhere, managing subordinate officers who were frustrated by the stalled advance, and trying to oversee the logistical nightmare of a war that had already exceeded all reasonable estimates. The physical toll on Homma was evident to those who saw him regularly during these weeks. He was a man in his mid-50s, and the weight of command during a crisis was aging him visibly. His staff officers reported that he worked late into the night, reviewing dispatches from Tokyo, studying intelligence reports on American movements, wrestling with problems that had no good solutions and many bad ones. Yet even as he labored, he was aware that his efforts were being scrutinized by men he could not control, and that the outcome of the campaign, whatever it might be, was already being interpreted through a lens of failure. Tokyo had set the timetable, and Tokyo had set the standard, and Tokyo was now making clear that the man they had entrusted with the execution of their plan had not measured up. The humiliation was not confined to the realm of military operations. It extended to matters of personal authority and respect. Homma had always understood himself as a soldier first and a politician second, a man who believed in the hierarchy of command and who respected the authority of the army's institutional structures. Yet now he was experiencing those structures not as a source of support, but as an instrument of pressure. The officers dispatched from Tokyo to oversee his operations did not report to him. They reported to the general staff. This meant that Homma had no authority over their activities, no ability to direct their efforts toward his strategic objectives, and no guarantee that their reports to Tokyo would represent his perspective fairly. Some of these emissaries were openly skeptical of Homma's capabilities and communicated this skepticism directly back to the capital. Others were more politic, but equally clear that the 14th Army commander had not delivered what had been promised. All of them, whatever their personal views, carried with them an implicit message that Homma was being watched, monitored, and found wanting. For a man of Homma's generation and background, shaped by military culture that prized honor, loyalty, and the respect of one's peers, this sustained questioning of his competence was a form of torture more refined and more effective than any physical punishment could have been. The question of responsibility for the logistical catastrophe that was beginning to accumulate became increasingly murky as Homma's authority dissolved. The original operational plans had called for rapid conquest and quick consolidation of control over the archipelago. Supply lines to support occupation had been calculated on the assumption that the campaign would follow the timetable. As months passed and prisoners accumulated, the question of who was responsible for feeding them, housing them, and moving them fell into the bureaucratic cracks between Homma's fractured command structure and the administrative apparatus that was itself being established almost in real time. Tokyo was sending contradictory orders about supply priorities, about the movement of troops, about the handling of conquered territories. Homma's subordinates were operating with varying degrees of clarity about what they were supposed to do, depending on which chain of command they were following on any given day. The logistical officers, who should have been coordinating the movement and administration of prisoners, were instead struggling to supply divisions that were engaged in active operations. The result was a system that functioned through crisis management, improvisation, and the delegation of impossible tasks to officers who had neither the resources nor the clear authority to execute them properly. By March of 1942, as the final collapse of the Bataan line approached, Homma was aware that the conquest of the Philippines, when it finally came, would not be his vindication, but his condemnation. He had delivered the objective that Tokyo had demanded, but he had taken 5 months to do it instead of 50 days. In the calculus of the Imperial Japanese Army, this was not merely a failure of speed. It was a failure of will, of boldness, of the absolute commitment to empire that Tokyo believed should animate a soldier of the highest caliber. Whether this judgment was fair, whether any commander could have done better given the strength and determination of American and Filipino resistance, was beside the point. The judgment had already been rendered by those who had sent the emissaries, who had divided the command structure, who had made it clear through their actions that Homma was no longer trusted with the full authority of an army commander. The general who had arrived in the Philippines 5 months earlier, with a schedule that he privately considered unrealistic, was now a man whose career was already ending, even though the most infamous chapter of his command was only beginning to unfold. The atmosphere in Homma's headquarters during these weeks was heavy with tension and unspoken reproach. The general continued to issue orders, to convene briefings, to maintain the formal structures of command that had always defined his professionalism. Yet everyone around him understood that these activities were largely symbolic, that the real decisions were being made elsewhere. This knowledge produced a peculiar kind of dysfunction in the headquarters staff. Officers who might normally have deferred to the commanding general on matters of strategy and administration were now more likely to seek guidance from Tokyo directly, understanding that such guidance had a force that Homma's orders, however technically valid, no longer possessed. The compartmentalization of command meant that information that should have flowed to Homma often did not, or arrived only after it had been filtered through other hands and interpreted according to other perspectives. The commanding general of the 14th Army was, by early 1942, a man presiding over a command structure that was increasingly beyond his effective control, yet remaining nominally responsible for everything that occurred within it. This contradiction between formal responsibility and actual authority would prove to be the central tragedy of Homma's command in the Philippines. When the Bataan line finally collapsed in early April, and the magnitude of the prisoner population became clear, when the decisions about how these prisoners would be moved and housed and fed had to be made with no time for careful planning or the arrival of properly coordinated orders from Tokyo, it was Homma who bore the ultimate responsibility, even though the authority to prevent the catastrophe that followed was already slipping from his hands. The general who had entered the Philippines as a careful planner, a man who believed in method and order and the proper execution of commands, found himself presiding over a campaign whose final phase would be shaped by chaos, institutional indifference, and failures of coordination that ran far deeper than any individual officer's decisions or intentions. The breakdown was already built into the system by the time the order to advance finally shattered the Bataan line. Tokyo's impatience, the fractured command structure, the logistical failures hidden beneath the surface of a campaign that had appeared, from a distance, to be progressing more or less according to plan. All of these would converge in the coming weeks to produce what history would remember as one of the war's most notorious atrocities. For Homma, the humiliation of having his authority questioned and divided would soon be eclipsed by far graver accusations about what occurred when his authority had been stripped away entirely. By the beginning of April in 1942, the Bataan Peninsula had become a graveyard, not yet visibly so to those who had not yet fallen, but psychologically, materially, the transformation was complete. The American and Filipino forces, holding the defensive lines that had held for months beyond the schedule Tokyo had permitted, were no longer capable of sustained resistance. They were starving. Dysentery and malaria had claimed more men than Japanese artillery. The medical situation had descended into a kind of quiet horror. Quinine was rationed to dangerous levels. Bandages were being washed and reused, and surgeons were performing amputations with the full knowledge that infection would likely finish what their scalpels had started. The will to fight had not disappeared, but it had become unmoored from the body's capacity to enact it. Men were eating their own leather belts. They were boiling tree bark for broth. Some were eating the horses that had been dying for weeks. The line was still there, still held by American regulars and Filipino conscripts side by side, but it was a line maintained by collective inertia rather than by hope or fighting strength. The Japanese, meanwhile, had finally assembled the force Homma had been requesting, with increasing desperation since February. Tokyo had at last accepted that the Bataan problem was not going to resolve itself in 50 days or 90 days, and reinforcements had begun arriving in the Philippines, including fresh divisions transferred from the occupation duties in Manchuria, and fresh artillery pieces being offloaded at Philippine ports. By early April, when the Japanese launched their renewed offensive against the starving defenders, the weight of numbers had shifted decisively in their favor. The American and Filipino soldiers, who had held their ground for 4 months with ammunition counted by the round and medicine by the tablet, now faced an enemy with supply lines that, while hardly flush, were at least functional. The psychological and material walls holding Bataan came down at last. The final Japanese offensive began around the 1st of April, and within days it became clear that organized resistance could not be maintained much longer. On the 9th of April, 1942, Major General Edward King stood before his assembled officers on the Bataan Peninsula and informed them that the time for surrender had come. The decision belonged to him alone, as the ranking American commander on the peninsula. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, the overall American commander in the Philippines, had retreated to the fortified island of Corregidor, and from that distance could offer only his reluctant consent to what King knew was now the only humane choice remaining. King was not a man given to emotional displays, but the officers who witnessed his announcement understood that he was ordering them to preside over the failure of their men and themselves. There was no glory in what came next, no Hollywood heroism to frame the moment. There was only the hard mathematics of starvation and disease, and the acknowledgement that prolonging the fight meant prolonging suffering without any change to the ultimate outcome. The order went out: cease fire, lay down your weapons, you are no longer fighting. You are now prisoners of war. The scale of what happened next had no true precedent in American military history. Roughly 75,000 to 80,000 men, American soldiers and Filipino conscripts, were now under Japanese control, and they had to go somewhere. The mechanics of this movement began almost immediately, and from the very first moments, things began to come apart. The Japanese had not prepared adequately for the capture of such vast numbers of prisoners. This was not a matter of deliberate malice, though malice would certainly enter the picture, but rather of institutional failure and logistical thinking that had operated on the assumption that any prisoners taken would be far fewer in number and far healthier in condition. The supplies that would have been necessary to move 75,000 people 100 kilometers or more, water, food, medical supplies, transport vehicles, had simply not been stockpiled or organized. The Japanese Quartermaster Corps found itself scrambling to improvise solutions to a problem it had hoped would not exist. This gap between expectation and reality is crucial to understanding what happened next, because it created the conditions in which both deliberate cruelty and catastrophic negligence became possible, and it becomes difficult, perhaps impossible, to neatly disentangle the two. The distance from the southern part of the Bataan Peninsula, where King had established his headquarters, to the designated prison camp near the town of Cabanatuan in the north, was roughly 100 kilometers along dusty roads that became rivers of mud during the rainy season and baking ovens in the tropical sun. The prisoners would have to march this distance on foot. They would have to march it in the heat of the Philippine dry season, when temperatures regularly exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. They would have to march it while suffering from advanced starvation and disease, their bodies already functioning on a fuel supply that had been inadequate for months. The march that became known to history as the Bataan Death March was not, in its conception, designed as an execution, but it was executed, that word matters, in conditions that made mass death nearly inevitable unless extraordinary measures were taken to prevent it. Those measures were not taken. By the morning of the 9th of April, Japanese soldiers began gathering American and Filipino prisoners and forcing them to begin moving northward. The column that formed was enormous, stretching across miles of road in a chaotic procession of exhausted men, their uniforms torn, their equipment abandoned, carrying nothing but the bodies they inhabited and whatever canteens or containers they had managed to bring with them. The prisoners were told to leave behind anything that could not be carried, and most of them had nothing to leave behind anyway. The march began in the morning heat. There was no adequate supply of water being distributed along the route. There were no designated rest periods long enough to allow men to recover from exertion. Japanese officers and guards had been given inconsistent orders about how strictly to manage the column, and the result was a kind of anarchic brutality, in which some guards showed something approaching humanity, while others, operating under their own interpretation of Japanese military discipline, or simply possessed of cruelty, began killing men who fell behind. The death toll began almost immediately. By the second day of the march, men were collapsing from heat exhaustion and dehydration. By the third day, Japanese guards were summarily executing prisoners who could not keep pace. The specific mechanics of death varied. Some men were shot, some were bayoneted, some were simply beaten to death with rifle butts, and some were left by the roadside to die of exposure and thirst when they could no longer move. The prisoners who survived the march would report, years later when they could finally speak about it, that there was a kind of mathematics of survival that had nothing to do with virtue or courage. The lucky ones were those near enough to the front of the column to access the rare water distribution points before supplies ran out. The unfortunate ones were those near the rear, who marched for hours without water, while seeing men ahead of them collapse and die. The vulnerable ones were those who had been sick before the march began, and many had been, because illness and the march worked together to accelerate death. Japanese officers, including Homma himself at various points, had issued orders that prisoners were to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but never ratified. The problem was that these orders existed on paper while the march existed on the ground, and the gap between them widened with each kilometer traveled. Some individual guards and junior officers ignored the orders entirely. Some tried to follow them and were overwhelmed by the conditions. Some interpreted them through a lens of Japanese military culture that saw surrender itself as a kind of dishonor that excused harsh treatment. The result was a cascade of suffering that accumulated into the thousands of dead. Conservative modern estimates place the number of deaths during the march itself at somewhere between 500 and 2,000, with the figure likely closer to the higher end. This was happening over the course of perhaps 4 to 6 days, depending on where a given group of prisoners began and when they reached their destination. It was happening in plain daylight on a peninsula that the Japanese now controlled, and it was happening while Homma, having finally been handed the victory Tokyo demanded, was dealing with the aftermath of victory in forms he had not anticipated. What followed the completion of the march was hardly better. The prisoners who survived the road journey arrived at the camp near Cabanatuan to find a place wholly unprepared to house them. There were no barracks, no hospital facilities, no adequate food supplies, no medical personnel waiting to treat the wounded and sick. Men were crowded into open fields and hastily constructed enclosures where sanitation was impossible. Dysentery and malaria, which had already killed thousands during the months on Bataan, continued their work. Medical care was essentially non-existent. The food distributed was minimal, often consisting of a small portion of rice once per day. The water supply was contaminated. The mortality rate in the camps following the march was catastrophic. Men who had survived the 4-month siege and the 100-kilometer march died of disease and starvation in the prison camps, at a rate that would kill most of the remaining population within months if it had continued unabated. By any measure, this was a humanitarian disaster of the first magnitude, and by any legal measure, it was a war crime. For Homma, standing now in possession of the victory that had eluded him for months, the situation confronting him was grotesque. He had finally broken the Bataan line. Tokyo would celebrate the capture of the peninsula, but he now faced a prisoner situation entirely without precedent in the campaign, and he had no institutional framework within which to manage it. His chain of command in Tokyo was indifferent. The prisoners were Tokyo's problem now, not his problem in the field. His logistics officers reported that they did not have the supplies to adequately care for 80,000 people. His medical officers reported that disease was spreading through the prison camps faster than treatment could address it. His subordinates were reporting that guards and officers in the field were not following his directives about prisoner treatment. The irony, which history would later tease out mercilessly, was that Homma had finally won his delayed victory, only to find it transformed into a catastrophe that would define his legacy far more completely than the military conquest ever could. The final Japanese offensive against Bataan had required 5 months, instead of the 50 days Tokyo initially demanded. That delay had made Homma seem a failure to his superiors, had eroded his authority, had invited the interference of Tokyo emissaries who took operational control away from him. But that same delay meant that when the peninsula finally fell, it fell to a commander who had at least been present throughout the campaign, who had some visibility into what had been happening, and who was now directly confronted with the prisoner situation he had inherited. What happened to those prisoners in the days following their surrender? What happened to them on the march? And what continued to happen to them in the camps that followed would hang over Homma for the remainder of his life. It was the price of the victory he had finally achieved, and it was a price that would be paid not in military terms, but in human suffering of a magnitude that would make the entire campaign seem, in retrospect, as though it had been undertaken not for military advantage, but for some other purpose entirely. The morning after the fall of Bataan, Homma would have known, at least in broad terms, what he now commanded. He would have known that he held 75,000 to 80,000 prisoners who had to be moved, fed, and housed. He would have known that the infrastructure to accomplish this did not exist. He would have known that his superiors in Tokyo were expecting him to solve this problem without materially additional resources. He would have known that the men under his command, exhausted from months of fighting, were now being asked to become prison guards and administrators for a population of unprecedented size. What he may not yet have fully grasped was that the moment of his greatest military success was also the moment at which his fate was being decided by forces far beyond his control, and that the story of the Bataan campaign, which should have ended with the satisfaction of a difficult military objective finally achieved, would instead be forever rewritten by what happened in the days and weeks that followed the surrender he had finally forced. On the 9th of April, 1942, Major General Edward King stood in the ruins of his command post on the Bataan Peninsula and made the hardest decision of his military life. The American and Filipino forces under his authority had held for 4 months against overwhelming Japanese assault, burning through ammunition, watching malaria consume men faster than bullets, rationing food to starvation levels. But the line had finally broken. The reinforced Japanese offensive, commanded now by officers sent from Tokyo to prod General Homma forward, had shattered the last coherent defensive position, and King faced a choice between a final suicidal stand that would accomplish nothing except the deaths of thousands more, or capitulation. He chose surrender. Within hours, roughly 75,000 to 80,000 men, Americans, Filipinos, and a handful of soldiers from other nations, lay down their weapons and became prisoners of the Japanese Empire. It was the largest surrender of American-led forces in American military history. For these men, most of them already weakened by hunger and tropical disease, the worst was not behind them. It was only beginning. The Japanese occupation army faced a sudden and staggering administrative crisis. Homma's planners had never seriously anticipated that so many prisoners would survive the campaign, because their original schedule had called for the Bataan operation to be completed in 50 days, not the 120 days that had actually elapsed. Supplies had been calculated for a much smaller prisoner population, and the infrastructure to house, feed, and guard tens of thousands of captives did not exist. There were no adequate camps prepared in the north. There were almost no medical facilities. There were no trucks enough to move a fraction of the prisoners, and the roads from the southern tip of Bataan to the camps near Cabanatuan and San Fernando were long, narrow, dusty, and ran through terrain where any meaningful provision of food or water would have required preparation that had not been made. The Japanese 14th Army, exhausted from its own months of combat, suddenly found itself tasked with one of the largest forced marches of prisoners in the entire Second World War, under conditions of such poor planning that disaster was almost inevitable from the moment the column began to move. On the 10th of April, the march began. Prisoners were gathered and divided into groups, some to be marched north on foot, others to wait for transportation that in many cases would never come. Those selected for the overland route were told, through interpreters and whispered rumor, that the journey would take only 2 or 3 days. Many prisoners were so starved and weakened by months of siege that a walk of more than 10 kilometers was already beyond their capacity, and the actual distance to be covered was roughly 100 kilometers. Dehydration was immediate and catastrophic. The roads were narrow, dusty, and choked with Japanese military traffic, trucks, supply wagons, artillery pieces, all moving north, and the prisoners marching under guard were pushed to the side into clouds of dust and heat that turned the simple act of breathing into a trial. Water stations had been promised and were largely absent. Guards at the few places where water was made available often restricted access or denied it entirely, either from cruelty or from genuine confusion about their orders, or from the simple fact that they had no authority to provide what had not been distributed to them. The combination of hunger, thirst, heat, and exhaustion began to break men down within the first day. The composition of the prisoner force made their vulnerability even more acute. Many of the American soldiers were already ill with malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery, contracted during the siege of Bataan, and the march could only worsen their condition. Filipino soldiers, conscripted into the armed forces, and often fighting on ground they knew, were sometimes in better physical condition at the start, but they suffered from the same deprivation and were often treated with more casual brutality by guards who viewed them as colonials rather than military peers. Medical officers and enlisted men, who had spent months treating the sick with almost no medicine, were powerless to help. Homesickness, fear, and the psychological shock of surrender piled on top of the physical ordeal, and men who had survived months of combat and siege began to collapse under the weight of a forced march conducted by an occupying army with neither the capacity nor, in many cases, the inclination to move them with any regard for their survival. The conduct of individual guards varied enormously, and this variation itself became part of the horror. Some Japanese soldiers showed compassion, shared their own water rations, turned away from beatings being administered by their comrades, or simply did not prevent prisoners from breaking ranks to find water or tend to the dying. Other guards participated in systematic brutality, beatings with rifle stocks for stumbling, bayoneting of stragglers who could not keep pace, summary execution of men who attempted to escape or who collapsed entirely. The worst abuses were not distributed randomly, but often clustered in particular units or under particular officers, and prisoner testimonies would later make clear that men under certain commanders faced a much higher probability of being killed or severely beaten than others marching the same roads. This meant that brutal luck, being assigned to a particular guard detail or marching in a particular column, could determine whether a prisoner lived or died, a grinding realization that accumulated over the days as bodies began to pile up along the routes, and prisoners who had survived Bataan began to understand that they might not survive captivity. The march stretched across days that blurred together in agony. The dust was so thick that men marching in the middle or rear of columns could barely see the road ahead. The sun was relentless, temperatures climbing into the upper 90s Fahrenheit and draining fluids from bodies already depleted by months on starvation rations. The meager food provided, small portions of rice, occasional lugao, a thin gruel, was inadequate to sustain men doing strenuous physical labor in tropical heat, and hunger gnawed constantly alongside thirst. Many prisoners developed sores and blisters on their feet that quickly became infected in the dirt and heat. Some men were given no shoes at all, or had lost them during the fighting on Bataan, and by the second and third days of marching, Their feet were raw and bloody. Others fell ill with sudden fevers or severe dysentery and could not continue. And the choice for these men was a kind of drawn-out dying, abandoned at the side of the road, sometimes shot mercifully if a guard took pity, sometimes left to expire slowly from untreated illness in the tropical heat. The prisoner columns became ghoulish processions of the broken and dying. Men who could no longer walk were sometimes carried on improvised stretchers or in the arms of stronger comrades, but this was possible only for a short distance before the carriers themselves gave out. Prisoners began to die by the dozens, then the hundreds. The number of deaths that occurred during the actual march proper in the first week exceeded 2,000, though exact figures are impossible to establish because the conditions prevented careful record-keeping and because the killing continued in phases. Some prisoners were killed outright. Others died from untreated disease, from heat exhaustion, from simple physiological collapse brought on by the combination of starvation, overexertion, and dehydration. The bodies were left where they fell, or in hastily dug graves, marked or unmarked. The living stepped over them and continued marching, too exhausted and traumatized to fully process what they were seeing. The march's most severe phase lasted roughly 10 days for those who marched the entire distance, though different groups experienced different timelines and different orders of horror. Many prisoners were not marched on foot at all, but crowded into railroad cars for the journey from San Fernando to Cabanatuan, and these railway transfers produced their own distinct catastrophes. Prisoners were packed so tightly into the cars that men died standing up, pressed against their comrades, unable to fall even in death. Some railroad cars were sealed, so that the heat inside became literally lethal. Prisoners who became insane from thirst, heat, and confinement sometimes tried to break through the wooden sides of the cars or attack their guards, and were shot or beaten. When the trains finally arrived at their destinations, after journeys that sometimes lasted more than a day, hundreds of men would be found dead or dying inside cars that smelled of human waste, sweat, and death. The railroad phase of the movement was often worse than the walking phase, though those who had marched were too destroyed to fully absorb this distinction. The camps at journey's end, primarily Cabanatuan, San Fernando, and other holding facilities, were themselves not prepared for the influx of prisoners and the scale of death that arrived with them. Medical care was virtually non-existent, despite the presence of surviving American and Filipino doctors among the prisoners themselves. Men who were desperate to help but largely forbidden from practicing medicine and lacking any medicine to distribute. Disease spread with horrifying speed through overcrowded compounds. The food rations, inadequate even in quantity, were often contaminated or stored in conditions that made them toxic. Dysentery, malaria, and pneumonia swept through the camps, killing men who had somehow survived the march itself. Some historians estimate that more than 5,000 prisoners died in the camps within the first few weeks after arrival, joining the thousands who had already expired on the roads and in the railroad cars. The total death toll from the march and its immediate aftermath, conservatively estimated at around 10,000 men, represented roughly 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 of the entire prisoner population that had been captured or forced to move. The responsibility for this catastrophe remains contested and complex. General Homma, who had been effectively sidelined during the critical days of the march by the senior officers sent from Tokyo to oversee him, would later claim that he was not in direct command during the period when the worst abuses occurred, and that he had not known the full extent of the killings and brutality. Records suggest that Homma was aware that the march would be difficult and that prisoners might die, but his explicit authorization or detailed knowledge of specific atrocities remains a matter of historical debate and courtroom argument. What is certain is that the march reflected not simply sadistic cruelty by individual guards, but also systemic administrative failure, inadequate planning by higher command, and a broader context in which the Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of prisoners and enemies was already brutal and contemptuous by any standard. The Bataan Death March emerged from this toxic combination of factors, none of which absolves anyone of responsibility, but all of which must be understood to grasp how such a disaster came to pass. News of the march's horrors spread slowly at first, through the prisoner network, and through those few individuals who managed to escape or be liberated. But within months, accounts began to reach American authorities, and then the American public. Survivor testimonies were collected and collated, and a picture emerged of one of the most notorious atrocities of the entire Pacific War. The march became a symbol of Japanese brutality and American suffering, a rallying point for rage and a demand for retribution. In the war rooms of Washington, and in the minds of American soldiers fighting across the Pacific, the Bataan Death March became something more than a military disaster. It became a moral marker, a reason why this war was worth fighting, and a shadow that would hang over every official and officer connected to it, including General Masaharu Homma, who would eventually stand trial for his role in allowing it to happen, whatever the precise extent of his knowledge or authorization. The march was over, but its consequences were only beginning. While tens of thousands of exhausted men shuffled northward along Bataan's roads in April of 1942, their feet bleeding and their thirst unquenched, the war in the Philippines was far from finished. Beyond Manila Bay, roughly 40 kilometers from the capital, a small island fortress rose from the water with the grim permanence of a sentry post that refused to fall. Corregidor had been transformed by years of American military planning into what was believed to be an almost impregnable stronghold, a rocky outcrop crowned with artillery positions, underground installations, and networks of tunnels that burrowed deep into the island's core. General Jonathan Wainwright, the senior American commander remaining in the Philippines after MacArthur's departure, had withdrawn to this fortress with several thousand American and Filipino soldiers, nurses, and support personnel, transforming it into the last visible symbol of American resistance in the archipelago. For Homma, now finally crowned with the capture of Bataan, Corregidor represented both an opportunity and a trap. The island could not be left unconquered. It would forever gnaw at the credibility of Japan's victory and threaten his supply lines. Yet assaulting a heavily fortified position across open water was precisely the kind of costly operation that had already lengthened his campaign far beyond Tokyo's tolerance. The clock, already running past schedule, ticked louder with every day that Corregidor remained defiant. The bombardment that followed was methodical, relentless, and devastating in its accumulated weight. Beginning almost immediately after the Bataan surrender, Japanese artillery positions on Luzon commenced a systematic pounding of the island that would continue for several weeks, transforming Corregidor's landscape from a functional military installation into a cratered moonscape of pulverized rock and shattered fortifications. The frequency of fire intensified as Homma accumulated more guns and ammunition around Manila Bay, bringing in additional artillery units and coordinate their efforts to saturate the island's defensive positions with high explosive ordnance. Survivors on Corregidor endured bombardments that lasted hours at a time, the ground heaving and convulsing as shells screamed in from multiple directions, filling the air with acrid smoke and the shriek of shrapnel. The Americans and Filipinos huddled in the underground tunnels and fortifications, counting detonations, checking supplies of water and medicine that were already critically short, and preparing for the assault they knew was coming. Anti-aircraft gunners, their rifles and light machine guns, utterly inadequate against the scale of firepower being directed at them, remained at their posts, knowing that their role in what was to come would be brief and fatal. The island's harbor, once a protected anchorage where American naval vessels had sheltered, became a graveyard of sunken ships and debris, each one a testament to the American position's growing isolation. Nurses and medical personnel worked in underground hospitals by candlelight and oil lamps, treating the wounded and dying with what few supplies remained, the sounds of explosions vibrating through the earth around them like the pulse of something vast and indifferent. By late April, the preliminary bombardment had achieved what Homma and his staff had calculated it would achieve: the destruction of Corregidor's surface defenses, the erosion of the garrison's supply situation to a critical state, and the killing or wounding of hundreds of defenders. What remained was the assault itself, and this was where the mathematics of amphibious warfare became the mathematics of death. Japanese planners assembled a force of roughly 4,000 troops for the assault, approximately 2,000 more than the defenders could muster, but the advantage of numbers meant little when crossing the open water of Manila Bay toward fortified positions, whose gunners would have clear fields of fire and desperate motivation. The Japanese selected several beaches on Corregidor's far side, calculating that the American defenders, already depleted and exhausted, would not have sufficient troops to hold every landing site simultaneously. The assault force was transported in assault boats and small vessels, a flotilla of vulnerable craft that would offer no protection against artillery or machine gun fire once the crossing began. Japanese naval support was arranged, with destroyers and fast patrol craft tasked with suppressing American defensive fire. But Corregidor's remaining gunners, though few, possessed guns of considerable power and accuracy, and every Japanese officer who planned the crossing understood that casualties would be severe. The psychological weight pressed on everyone involved. This was to be the final gasp of American resistance in the Philippines, the moment that would complete Homma's campaign and prove that the empire's conquest was absolute. For the Americans and Filipinos awaiting this assault in underground tunnels and damaged fortifications, it represented the ending of a chapter that had already become unimaginably tragic. The assault commenced on the night of the 11th of May 1942, under cover of darkness, and a withering bombardment that sought to suppress the American gun positions, while Japanese assault troops crossed the bay in their small boats. The initial landings achieved tactical surprise, with Japanese troops establishing beachheads on the western side of the island, despite fierce and accurate American machine gun fire that raked the landing beaches and inflicted immediate casualties on the assault wave. Japanese soldiers waded ashore through shallow water, encountering scattered American defensive positions that fought with a ferocity born of the knowledge that retreat was impossible, that this was the end of the line. The night fighting was chaotic and brutal, characterized by close-quarters combat in darkness, Japanese troops pressing inland from the beaches, despite mounting casualties, American defenders being slowly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers pouring ashore. As dawn broke on the 12th of May, the Japanese reinforced their beachheads with fresh troops and, more importantly, with light artillery and machine guns that began to establish Japanese fire superiority over the remaining American positions. Wainwright, observing from his command post in the tunnels, watched the situation deteriorate throughout the day, his defensive perimeter contracting as Japanese forces pushed inland and began to sweep across the island toward the central ridge where the main American installations stood. The American garrison, already depleted by weeks of bombardment and months of warfare, found itself unable to concentrate sufficient force to dislodge the Japanese beachhead or hold the island's interior. Men fell from machine gun fire, grenades, and artillery. The medical teams in the underground hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded, far beyond their capacity to treat. By the afternoon of the 12th of May, Wainwright faced a decision as agonizing as the one General King had made on Bataan days before. His position was untenable. The Japanese controlled the beaches, held the high ground on the western portion of the island, and were systematically advancing toward his command post, despite fierce American resistance. His troops were exhausted, short of ammunition, and reduced to a handful of thousands. Surrender was no longer merely one option among several. It had become the only rational choice remaining. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, on the 12th of May, 1942, Wainwright authorized a white flag to be raised over Corregidor, ending the campaign for the Philippines. The Japanese assault troops, meeting less resistance as the American defenders stood down, advanced rapidly toward the command installations and formally accepted the surrender of all remaining American and Filipino forces in the archipelago. Homma's campaign, which had been scheduled to conclude in 50 days, was now technically complete after roughly 5 months of fighting, with Corregidor as the final domino to fall. The symbolic weight of this moment cannot be overstated. The Philippines, the great American colonial possession in the Western Pacific, was now in Japanese hands. The American flag came down. The Japanese flag rose in its place, above the smoking ruins of what had been the primary American military installation in Southeast Asia. What Homma did not know, what none of the Japanese commanders celebrating the conquest of Corregidor fully grasped in that moment of victory, was that the images and testimonies of the Bataan Death March were beginning to reach the American public, filtered through interviews with escapees, radioed reports from guerrilla forces remaining in the mountains of Luzon, and the debriefings of captured American personnel who had endured the march and, through accident or deliberate escape, made their way back to Allied lines. The newspapers of the United States, hungry for stories of Japanese atrocity, to balance the propaganda narrative of Japanese invincibility, seized upon these accounts with intense interest. Reports spoke of American soldiers bayoneted while unable to continue marching, of deliberate denial of water during the tropical heat, of casual killings by guards, of summary executions of Filipino prisoners. The scale was being pieced together slowly, but with growing clarity. Somewhere between 600 and more than 1,000 American soldiers had died on the march, along with a vastly larger number of Filipino troops whose suffering was being recorded, but in less detail, whose deaths were less likely to be counted in the American consciousness. The American public, which had absorbed the initial shock of Pearl Harbor and months of military reversal in the Pacific, suddenly found in the Death March narrative a story that transformed the Pacific War from a strategic competition between empires into a moral crusade against an enemy that systematized brutality against prisoners. Homma's triumph at Corregidor would be his last moment of uncomplicated military success. The victory would be buried almost immediately beneath the avalanche of testimony, photographs, and survivor accounts that began to reshape how America understood both the war and the man who had commanded the forces in the Philippines. For Wainwright and the American survivors gathered on Corregidor and held in Japanese custody, the moment of surrender began a different kind of ordeal. Wainwright, the ranking American officer in the Philippines, would spend the remaining years of the war as a prisoner, eventually transported to Manchuria and held captive until Japan's final defeat. The other prisoners, the soldiers, nurses, and support personnel, would be distributed among various prisoner of war camps throughout the Philippines and beyond, subject to the same harsh conditions, inadequate food, and disease that characterized the Japanese treatment of captives generally. The fall of Corregidor did not bring an end to suffering. It transformed its nature and location. In the months and years that followed, prisoners would die of disease, malnutrition, and the cumulative weight of captivity, their names added silently to the ledger of the war's human cost. For those who survived and returned home, Corregidor's fall became inseparable in their memories from the Death March, 2 chapters of a single catastrophe that had consumed them when they were most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves. Homma, meanwhile, stood in Manila in mid-May of 1942, technically victorious, but acutely aware that victory tasted of ash. His campaign, wildly behind schedule and absurdly over budget in the lives of his soldiers, had finally achieved its stated objective. The Philippines, which he had never wanted to command, which had resisted him at every turn, which had made a fool of his schedule and inflicted humiliating delays on his timetable, were now under Japanese control from the Luzon Plains to the remote island fortresses of the south. American power in the Western Pacific had been broken, or so it seemed, but the cost had been staggering, and worse still, the cost had been publicly evident. The failures had been broadcast throughout Japan, the delays had been impossible to hide, and officers in Tokyo who had selected him for this command were already beginning to whisper that Homma had failed to achieve his objectives on schedule, and that this failure, regardless of the eventual military result, reflected poorly on his judgment and his competence. He would not remain in command of the Philippines for long. What had seemed like a magnificent opportunity at the outset of the war was transforming, in the minds of Tokyo's high command, into a stain on his record that no amount of military success could wash away. And hovering beneath even these career calculations was something that Homma could not yet see clearly, but would eventually confront in full: the death march that had occurred in the valleys and roads of Bataan while he struggled against the defenses of the Bataan line, an episode that would attach itself to his name and define his legacy far more completely than his conquest of Corregidor or any other military accomplishment ever could. In early May of 1942, General Masaharu Homma stood at the pinnacle of a Japanese military achievement that the empire would never fully replicate in the Pacific War. The Philippine Islands, once the crown jewel of American colonial possession in Asia, were now under the command and occupation of Japanese forces. The fortified island of Corregidor had surrendered. General Jonathan Wainwright had broadcast his capitulation to all remaining American forces across the Pacific, and the machinery of the 14th Army, bloodied and exhausted but technically victorious, stood ready to consolidate Japan's control over this vast archipelago. By every measure of territorial conquest, Homma had delivered what Tokyo had demanded: the seizure of a strategic prize that would secure Japan's southern perimeter, provide access to the resources of the Dutch East Indies, and establish a fortress line against American counteroffensive. Yet, as Homma prepared to return to Tokyo for recognition and reassignment, he was about to discover that in the hierarchy of Japanese military ambition, the clock mattered more than the conquest itself. The problem was not conquest, it was timing, or rather, the catastrophic failure of timing. Tokyo had handed Homma an order of battle that assigned the complete subjugation of the Philippines a window of approximately 50 days. It was an audacious schedule, born from an overestimation of Japanese capabilities and an underestimation of American and Filipino resistance, but it had been the explicit requirement handed down from Imperial General Headquarters. Homma had privately harbored doubts about this timetable even before the campaign began, and those doubts had been vindicated by the grinding reality of the Bataan stalemate, which had consumed month after month of campaign time and chewed through Japanese divisions with a casualty rate that would eventually approach 50,000 men. By the time the final American defenses crumbled, the campaign had stretched well beyond 5 months, a duration that represented nothing less than a humiliation to the planning apparatus of the Japanese General Staff, and a public relations catastrophe for an empire that had promised its people a swift, decisive victory. When Homma returned to Tokyo in mid-May of 1942, he did not encounter the ceremonial recognition traditionally afforded to victorious commanders. Instead, he found a capital seized with a peculiar brand of fury. The conquest itself was acknowledged, but the method and duration were treated as symptoms of failure rather than obstacles overcome. Senior officers at Imperial General Headquarters, who had been personally invested in the 50-day timeline, were suffering political consequences for their miscalculation, and in the way of military hierarchies everywhere, the responsibility for the failure was distributed downward to the field commander, who had, in their view, mismanaged the execution of a sound plan. Yet the fact that Homma had been repeatedly requesting additional forces while the stalemate persisted, that he had warned throughout the campaign that Tokyo's expectations were unrealistic, and that he had ultimately delivered the objective regardless of the timeline, none of this seemed to matter. He had not met the deadline, and in an institution where face and precision were cultural imperatives, the magnitude of the lateness overshadowed the magnitude of the accomplishment. The psychological trauma of this reception cannot be understated. Homma had endured 5 months of grinding pressure, had navigated the subtle but unmistakable shift in November of 1942, when Imperial General Headquarters had begun sending senior officers to the Philippines to effectively supervise and ultimately displace his operational authority. He had watched younger, more politically connected commanders be assigned divisions, while his own direction of the campaign was increasingly marginalized and second-guessed. He had contended with the logistical nightmare of the Bataan situation, a catastrophe that had grown out of factors both within and beyond his control, even as he was being blamed for not preventing it. And he had done all of this while maintaining the composure and discipline expected of a Japanese officer, never openly complaining, never breaking the rigid chain of command that was the spine of military culture. Now, having finally delivered what had been demanded, he was being treated not as a conquering general, but as a competent administrator who had fumbled the execution. The institutional response to Homma was swift and merciless, though carefully disguised by the language of military necessity. He was informed that he would be reassigned to the Second Army, a reserve formation with limited operational significance, and would be based in the Manchuria military district, far from the centers of power and influence. It was a posting that on paper represented no particular disgrace. The Second Army was a real command with real responsibilities, but within the context of the Japanese military hierarchy, it was nothing less than exile. Homma was being removed from the main theater of the war, at the moment when that theater was expanding, and when the opportunities for glory and advancement were multiplying. Officers of his rank and seniority would normally expect to be assigned to replacement commands in Burma, in the Central Pacific, or in positions where they could still influence the direction of the war. Instead, he was being placed in a geographical and operational backwater, effectively removed from the opportunity to shape the war's outcome, and denied any realistic path to rehabilitation of his standing or his reputation. Yet the irony that would haunt Homma for the remainder of his life was being constructed even as he received his reassignment. The atrocities of the Bataan Death March, the deaths, the brutality, the collapse of administrative coherence that had allowed both deliberate cruelty and negligent indifference to flourish on a massive scale, were being concealed even from the Japanese military establishment. The march had taken place, and thousands had died, but the details were being compartmentalized, classified, and deliberately suppressed by elements within the Imperial Japanese Army, who understood that full disclosure would create scandal and further damage to already wounded reputations. Homma, who was being punished for his tardiness in conquest, was not being held accountable for the march, because the march's true dimensions were being kept from public view and from the upper reaches of government. It was a bitter reversal that would only become clear in the years after the war, when Homma would be tried, not for his failure to meet an arbitrary timetable, but for his failure to prevent or control what had happened to 75,000 prisoners during an operation that had occurred on his watch and under his name. The years that followed Homma's reassignment were marked by a quiet descent from military significance into something closer to irrelevance. He moved to Manchuria and performed his duties as commander of the Second Army with the same professionalism and attention to detail that had characterized his entire career, but he was aware that he was marching through the remaining years of a war that his contributions to would be neither remembered nor valued. The strategic situation in the Pacific was deteriorating rapidly for Japan. American forces were beginning their island-hopping campaign, and the tempo of naval and air operations was increasing month by month. Yet Homma, positioned in Manchuria, was far removed from these developments and unable to influence them. His command responsibility was primarily the defense of Manchuria against a potential Soviet invasion. A significant strategic concern, to be certain, but one that many in Tokyo believed would never materialize, and that therefore did not receive the resources or the attention that was being lavished on the desperate defense of island positions across the Pacific. During these years of military exile, Homma seems to have experienced a personal transformation, or perhaps a return to an earlier version of himself. The officer who had been so intellectually curious in his London posting, who had maintained a passion for literature and poetry even as he rose through the ranks, emerged again in the Manchurian exile. He began to paint, to compose poetry, and to withdraw from the social and professional circles that had once defined his life. Those who knew him during this period described a man who had accepted that his military career was effectively finished, and who had turned his attention to pursuits that seemed almost deliberately removed from the demands of war and command. There is a poignancy in this retreat into the contemplative arts, a general trying to find meaning in brushwork and verse, rather than in the campaigns and decisions that had defined his public existence. It suggests a man who understood, perhaps more clearly than many of his peers, that the institution he had served had discarded him, and that his only remaining path was to withdraw from that institution before it could do further damage to his legacy or his soul. The Japanese military establishment, meanwhile, was maintaining its silence about the Death March. Survivors who had been liberated or had escaped to other islands were being gathered, and their testimonies were being recorded. But the information was not being circulated to the Japanese public or to the international community in any systematic way. Those officers and soldiers who had direct knowledge of what had occurred during the march were in many cases still serving in the field or in positions where they could not be interrogated without disrupting the chain of command. Some of them, aware of the gravity of what they had witnessed or participated in, were themselves participating in the effort to suppress the story. It was a form of institutional denial that ran deep through the military hierarchy, an unwillingness to acknowledge that a campaign of conquest had produced a catastrophe that could not be explained away by the exigencies of war or the pressures of command. The responsibility for that catastrophe rested, ultimately, with the commander of the 14th Army, but as long as the truth remained suppressed, Homma could be punished for his tardiness, without being held accountable for the deaths that had accumulated during the march. What made this dynamic particularly tragic was that it represented a form of protection that Homma neither sought nor welcomed. He was not aware, during these years of exile, that his silence and his absence from the public discourse about the Philippines campaign were effectively insulating him from an even more severe reckoning. Had the full truth about the march been disclosed during the war, had Homma been forced to defend his command responsibility in real time and in the glare of international scrutiny, the consequences might have been far more severe than simple reassignment to a reserve posting. The suppression of the story bought him years of a relatively quiet life, years in which he could retreat into his art and his poetry, and his private reflections on the course of the war and his own role in it. Yet it was a protection that came with a terrible price, because when the truth did eventually emerge after the war, when survivors' testimonies were collected and documented, and when the American military establishment began to piece together what had actually occurred, Homma would have no defense. He would be the man whose name was attached to one of the war's most notorious atrocities, tried in a tribunal that his critics would argue was fundamentally compromised, and ultimately executed for a catastrophe that had unfolded under his command, but which he had been allowed to forget about, or at least to compartmentalize, for the 3 years of war that remained. In Manchuria, as the war ground toward its final year, Homma watched the strategic situation contract around Japan like a closing fist. The island nations that had been conquered in the early flush of the southern offensive were being retaken one by American forces. The home islands themselves were facing increasing bombardment from American long-range aircraft. The Navy had been destroyed or rendered impotent, and the Army was being forced into increasingly desperate positions across the Pacific and in China. Homma's posting in Manchuria meant that he was somewhat insulated from the worst of this deterioration, but it also meant that he was utterly powerless to affect it. He was a general without an army in any meaningful sense, a commander whose authority extended over territories that would never see combat, a man whose entire professional identity had been predicated on capability and command, and who now had neither in any form that mattered. When news came in August of 1945 that Japan had surrendered unconditionally, that the war was over, and that the empire had been defeated, Homma received the information not as a revelation, but as the confirmation of something that had been apparent for years. He did not know, in those final days of the war, that the Death March would become the central fact of his historical legacy, that survivors would eventually tell their stories, that American military prosecutors would reconstruct the events of April 1942 with painstaking detail, that he would be arrested and tried and convicted and executed for his command responsibility in a catastrophe that had unfolded 5,000 miles away and 3 years in the past. He did not know that his retreat into painting and poetry, his attempt to find some measure of dignity and purpose beyond the reach of the military institution that had rejected him, would be interrupted by American soldiers who would come for him with arrest warrants and accusations. What Homma knew, in the late summer of 1945, was that he had been a general who took too long to win, that he had been cast aside by the institution he had served, and that he had spent 3 years trying to forget both facts, through the cultivation of aesthetic pursuits that could never fully reconcile him to what had happened or what he had done. In the weeks following the surrender of Bataan, a story began to emerge from the wreckage of the Philippine Islands that would transform American public perception of the war in the Pacific and reshape the moral reckoning with Japan itself. The first witnesses were scattered and fragmented, men who had escaped the columns during the chaos of the march itself, soldiers who had hidden in the jungle as the Japanese forces moved northward, and a handful who had survived the camps and found their way to places where American forces could recover their testimony. Their accounts were disjointed at first, often contradicting in detail, limited by trauma and the fog of survival itself. Yet the accumulation of these early reports, carried through military channels and gradually reaching American newspapers and radio broadcasts, began to sketch an outline of something that official records had either minimized or entirely suppressed. What Tokyo had announced as a successful military operation, the capture of vast quantities of enemy personnel and material, now acquired a shadow. Whispers of a catastrophe, a humanitarian disaster attended by cruelty that seemed to exceed even the calculated brutality that soldiers expected in wartime. The American public, already angry over the shock of Pearl Harbor and the humiliations of the Pacific Campaign's early months, began to hear fragments of a narrative that would not be forgotten. Among the first survivors to provide detailed testimony was Major Alunade Rogers, one of the few high-ranking American officers to escape the Death March and make his way back to American lines. Rogers, who had served under General Jonathan Wainwright during the siege of Bataan, carried in his memory a stark record of what he had witnessed during those terrible weeks. The deliberate denial of water to the marching columns on days of sweltering tropical heat, the bayoneting of soldiers who fell behind and could not keep pace, the beatings administered without warning or cause to men already at the absolute threshold of physical endurance. His testimony, delivered to American Army intelligence officers and later made available to the press, provided not merely anecdotal suffering, but a structured account of systematic mistreatment. Evidence that suggested not random brutality by individual guards, but a pattern that extended throughout the march and potentially indicated higher command knowledge, or at minimum, grotesque negligence. Rogers was not alone in offering such testimony. Other escaped prisoners provided corroborating details that, taken together, suggested that the Death March had been far more terrible than the coded messages and fragmentary intelligence reports had initially indicated. The American military intelligence apparatus, operating under the authority of the War Department in Washington and the headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific Theater, began the methodical work of collecting and analyzing survivor testimony, cross-referencing accounts, and attempting to construct a comprehensive picture of what had occurred from early April through May of 1942. What emerged was a document of horror that would eventually run to hundreds of pages, detailed accounts of specific locations where mass killings had taken place, descriptions of guards, identified by name and distinguishing characteristics, tallies of the dead based on eyewitness observations, and, where possible, Japanese records. The intelligence officers working on this task understood they were building not merely a historical record, but a potential foundation for future legal accountability. That somewhere in this mass of testimony lay the threads of command responsibility that might eventually lead to those who had ordered or knowingly permitted such conduct. Their work was meticulous and methodical, lacking the theatrical quality of what would later occur in courtrooms, but it possessed an undeniable power. It was the careful construction of proof. By the middle of 1942, accounts of the Death March began to leak into American newspapers, carried by war correspondents, with access to military briefings, and by families of survivors who received letters or whose sons had escaped and returned with stories too terrible to remain private. The American press, operating under wartime censorship but with considerable latitude in matters of enemy atrocities, seized upon the narrative with fervor. Newspapers that had printed photographs of American soldiers celebrating battlefield victories now began running stories that positioned the Death March as evidence of Japanese cruelty and inhumanity. a calculated effort to turn public revulsion into support for the war effort, and a renewed commitment to victory at any cost. Radio broadcasts carried summaries of survivor testimony. Magazines published detailed accounts that, while necessarily sanitized from their rawest details, nevertheless conveyed the scale and character of the suffering. The Death March, in short, became a weapon in America's propaganda war against Japan, and this transformation of suffering into propaganda did not diminish the truth of what had occurred. It weaponized it, gave it a purpose beyond mere documentation. The psychological effect on the American public was profound and measurable. Prior to the wide dissemination of Death March accounts, American soldiers and civilians possessed a certain abstract understanding that the Pacific War was bitter and that the Japanese enemy was ruthless. But the Death March provided something more visceral: names, locations, specific acts of cruelty, and faces. The identities of both perpetrators and victims became known. Captured Japanese soldiers would later report that American troops, motivated partially by the stories of the Death March, exhibited markedly decreased inclination toward mercy in direct combat. And while this represented a troubling moral complication, it also represented the profound impact that the revelation of the march had achieved in transforming American public sentiment. The war in the Pacific, which had initially felt geographically remote and somehow less morally acute than the war in Europe, with its ideological confrontation with Nazism, now acquired its own moral clarity. It was to be fought not merely for strategic victory, but for retribution against a foe that had shown itself capable of monstrous cruelty against prisoners who were defenseless. Among those who contributed to piecing together the larger narrative of the march was General Douglas MacArthur himself, the very commander whose forces had initially been defeated and whose men had suffered in the columns. MacArthur, operating from his headquarters in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and later from Manila itself, as the American advance pushed deeper into the Philippine Islands, ensured that intelligence about Japanese conduct during the march was collected and preserved. MacArthur understood the historical and legal significance of what was being documented. He also understood its propaganda value. MacArthur was not a man inclined towards subtlety in matters of his own authority or vindication, and the Death March narrative served multiple purposes for him simultaneously. It explained why the Philippine campaign had been so costly and why Japanese forces, despite their initial advantages, had inflicted such heavy casualties on American troops. It positioned the march as evidence of Japanese barbarity that justified the increasingly total nature of American retaliation, and it created a historical record that might eventually justify calling powerful figures to account. Whether MacArthur's motivations in this matter were principally moral, political, or some unresolved mixture of both, remains a question that historians continue to argue. The testimony accumulated in the months and years following the march began to reveal patterns of conduct that extended beyond the road itself. Survivors spoke of beatings at collection points where prisoners were assembled before the march began, of mass executions at destinations where the columns arrived, of prisoners left to die of disease and starvation in camps that were equipped with neither food nor medicine to sustain the numbers of men being held. The range of brutality documented included acts of extraordinary individual cruelty, soldiers bayoneting the exhausted, officers beheading prisoners for minor infractions or no infraction at all, but also acts of institutional negligence that were perhaps equally lethal in their cumulative effect. The Japanese army, operating at the outer limits of its logistical capacity and with command structures that had been fractured and partially diverted to other operations, had simply not prepared to handle 75,000 to 80,000 prisoners of war being moved across a tropical island. This failure of preparation could be attributed to incompetence, to arrogance, to an assumption that prisoners would be less than human and therefore less deserving of consideration, or to some combination of all three. The effect, however, was unambiguous. Men died in thousands from causes that proper administration might have prevented. As the American forces gradually pushed northward through the Philippine Islands and eventually back toward Luzon itself, they recovered additional evidence and testimony from people who had lived through the march or witnessed it from the periphery. Filipino civilians provided accounts of columns passing through their towns, of prisoners collapsing on the roads, of Japanese guards shooting or bayoneting those who could not continue. American soldiers who had escaped the march earlier provided additional details about Japanese command structure, about the orders they had heard given, about the identity of officers and non-commissioned officers who had been particularly notorious for their brutality. This accumulating testimony began to suggest that while certainly some of the brutality had been the work of individual sadists, men whose personal cruelty stood out even in the context of a war conducted with diminished regard for the laws of warfare, there was also evidence of a more systematic pattern that suggested something more than individual pathology. The question of whether General Homma himself had known what was occurring, whether he had ordered it, whether he had made any effort to prevent it, and whether he bore responsibility for failures of command that had allowed it to occur, began to crystallize in the minds of those constructing the historical and legal record. The narrative of the Death March that reached the American public in 1942 and 1943 was both accurate and partial. It accurately reflected the terrible suffering and documented cruelty, but it necessarily omitted the context and complexity that full understanding would later demand. The American military courts and officers who would eventually prosecute Japanese figures for the march had reason both to emphasize the scale of the atrocity and to frame it in ways that supported their own institutional and legal claims. Yet this does not diminish the underlying reality. Thousands of men had died, many of them from causes that were preventable, many of them killed by deliberate acts of cruelty. The distinction between inflated propaganda, useful exaggeration, and documented fact is genuinely important for historical accuracy, but it is also important not to use such distinctions as an excuse to minimize or rationalize what had actually occurred. The Death March was a real catastrophe, and its revelation to the American public was a genuine historical watershed. By the time Japan formally surrendered in August of 1945, the Death March had been transformed into something that inhabited multiple registers simultaneously. It was historical fact. It was propaganda tool. It was source of American anger toward Japan. It was foundation for legal accountability. And it was deeply personal trauma for the survivors and the families of the dead. The testimony of survivors had been preserved in military files and court records. Journals and letters written during or immediately after the march had been collected. Eyewitness accounts had been recorded by military investigators. This archive of suffering and documentation became, in effect, a charge sheet waiting to be converted into legal proceedings. The question that would animate the trials to come was whether the attention and resources devoted to investigating and documenting the Death March would be matched by the rigor and fairness applied in determining who bore responsibility for it. That question would prove more complicated and more contested than anyone anticipated. The war that had consumed Japan for nearly 15 years ended not with a final battle, but with a broadcast. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radio waves in a tone that most ordinary listeners had never heard before. Formal, distant, speaking of the need to accept the unacceptable. Masaharu Homma, now 58 years old, listened from his quiet house in Tokyo, a man who had spent the last 3 years in deliberate obscurity, painting watercolors and composing verse, trying to forget that he had ever worn a uniform at all. The emperor spoke of Japanese honor and the necessity of bearing the unbearable, but what Homma understood with absolute clarity was that his own private exile had just ended, and something far worse was about to begin. The machinery of defeat was already turning, and somewhere in that machinery, the names of the men who had commanded Japan's armies were already being compiled. Homma's name would not be far from the top of that list. The initial chaos of Japan's surrender was profound and disorienting. Military units were dissolving, officers were destroying records, and there was genuine confusion about what authority held power in the immediate aftermath of imperial capitulation. American forces were pouring into the home islands, and the occupation would soon become the defining reality of Japanese life. But in those first days and weeks, the machinery of military justice that would pursue men like Homma was still being assembled in distant capitals. The Allies had committed themselves during the war to the principle that military leaders would be held accountable for the violations their armies had committed, but the practical machinery for identifying, locating, arresting, and trying those leaders barely existed. It would have to be built while the rubble was still smoking, and while the emotions of the newly victorious were still white-hot with rage. Homma, who had lived so carefully in recent years, understood that his invisibility would not protect him. The Bataan Death March had become one of the most notorious atrocities of the Pacific War, reported in American newspapers, converted into propaganda, transformed into a symbol of Japanese barbarity that no American court would simply overlook. MacArthur's forces had documentation, survivor testimony, and a burning need to demonstrate that American justice would reach even those officers who tried to hide in the retreating wreckage of empire. Homma's arrest came in late August or early September of 1945, barely 3 weeks after the emperor's announcement. The circumstances were in some ways mundane, in other ways surreal. American soldiers arrived at his residence in Tokyo, moving with the efficiency of men executing orders that required no particular hatred, simply compliance. Homma, according to various accounts, accepted the inevitability of his situation with resignation, offering no resistance and apparently unsurprised that the occupation authorities had moved so quickly to find him. He had served in London decades earlier. He had absorbed something of Western legal tradition, even if he had never expected to be on the receiving end of a victor's tribunal. His wife, the American woman he had married, looked on as her husband was taken into custody, and the peculiar tragedy of their relationship, that she had married a man who had commanded forces that killed American soldiers, was now entering its final chapter. Homma was transported to a detention facility in Japan, where he would wait through the autumn and into the winter, held in conditions that were not brutal, but which carried their own claustrophobic weight. He was permitted no visits, minimal contact with the outside world, and the growing understanding that his fate was no longer his own to determine. The transportation of Homma from Japan to the Philippines was itself a journey laden with meaning and symbolism. He traveled under American guard, crossing the same seas and moving toward the same island archipelago that he had conquered 4 years earlier, with the full power of the Japanese military behind him. Now he was a prisoner, an accused war criminal, being delivered to Manila, where the final accounting would take place. The voyage itself was long enough for Homma to contemplate the reversal that had occurred, and there are accounts suggesting that he maintained his composure throughout, speaking with guards, accepting his circumstances with the stoicism that Japanese military culture had instilled in him since youth. The Philippines that Homma approached in late 1945 or early 1946 was not the same territory he had conquered in 1941. Manila itself, the jewel of his campaign, had been devastated by the fighting that followed his removal from command. American counteroffensive operations in 1944 and 45 had turned the city into a battleground, and the photographs and descriptions of Manila in early 1946 show a place still half destroyed, still smoking in places, still bearing the visible scars of urban combat. The Filipinos who had survived the war, and millions had not, were watching to see what would become of the Japanese general who had overseen the beginning of their 4-year occupation and suffering. The atmosphere in Manila as Homma was brought to face military justice was charged with an intensity that no trial in a distant capital could have generated. This was not a proceeding conducted in an abstract courtroom in Washington or London, remote from the places where the alleged crimes had been committed. This was justice unfolding in the very city from which the Japanese occupation had been administered, in a place where 10,000 civilians had died in the battle for Manila itself in 1945, where the scars of Japanese and American occupation were both still visible, where the weight of recent suffering still pressed down on the population. The American servicemen and servicewomen who had returned to Manila to secure and rebuild the city carried their own direct experiences of the war in the Pacific, and among them were survivors of the Bataan Death March, men whose emaciated frames and haunted eyes had become symbolic of what the Japanese had done in the Philippines. The very fact that Homma was being tried in Manila rather than in some neutral location was itself a statement about the nature of the proceedings. This was not abstract justice. This was the victors bringing an accused defendant to the place of his alleged crimes and demanding accountability in front of the community that had suffered those crimes. MacArthur, as the supreme commander of American forces in the Pacific, had orchestrated this choice with absolute deliberation. The detention of Homma in Manila, awaiting trial, proceeded through the latter months of 1945 and into the opening months of 1946, a period during which the military tribunal that would try him was still being assembled and its procedures were still being determined. He was held in a secure facility, allowed basic amenities but no luxuries, his access to communication with the outside world sharply restricted. The lawyers who would defend him were American and Filipino officers assigned to his case under military regulations that required some semblance of defense, even if the circumstances were heavily weighted toward conviction. Homma had access to translations of documents, could confer with his counsel, and began to prepare his defense on the grounds of his argument that he had been effectually removed from operational command during the period when the Bataan Death March occurred, and that he had not possessed full knowledge of the extent of the atrocities being committed in his name. This was not an argument of innocence. It was an argument of degree, of the question of how much a commander could be held responsible for the actions of subordinates operating in conditions of chaos and supply collapse. Whether that argument would be believed was an entirely different question, and Homma's lawyers would have understood from the outset that they were not defending a man in an impartial courtroom, but rather arguing before military officers who had themselves lost comrades to Japanese brutality. The arrival of evidence and testimony in preparation for the trial added another layer of weight to Manila's already heavy atmosphere. Survivor testimony from the Bataan Death March was collected and translated, and the accounts were as devastating as they were detailed. Men described being forced to march in tropical heat with minimal water, being bayoneted for lagging, watching fellow prisoners collapse and die along the roadside, and reaching the destination camps where disease and starvation continued the work that the march had begun. Some of these survivors were themselves now in Manila, watching from the courtroom as the general who had commanded the army responsible for their suffering prepared to face judgment. The psychological impact of these presences, of living witnesses to atrocity, sitting mere feet away from the accused, cannot be overstated. This was not a trial conducted in abstraction, but rather in the immediate presence of the wounds that the alleged crime had inflicted. The Manila press, now operating under American authority, but with considerable Philippine voice, covered the preparations intensely, and public sentiment in the city was abundantly clear. There was little presumption of innocence, little patience for complicated arguments about command structure or supply failures. There was instead a hunger for accountability, for visible punishment, for some demonstration that the Americans had come not merely as military conquerors, but as agents of justice. MacArthur's role in all of this was itself a source of extraordinary tension, though one that was largely implicit rather than openly discussed in the lead-up to the trial. As Supreme Commander of American forces in the Pacific, MacArthur held authority over the entire occupation of Japan and the Philippines, and he had personally decided to establish a military tribunal in Manila and had appointed the officers who would serve on it. More provocatively, MacArthur had also retained authority over any appeal from the tribunal's verdict and could theoretically recommend clemency to President Truman, or he could confirm the sentence if conviction was rendered. This concentration of power in the hands of the very commander whose forces had been defeated by Homma in 1941 and whose men had suffered on the Bataan March created a structural conflict of interest that legal scholars have scrutinized ever since. MacArthur and Homma had never met in combat. They had never faced each other across a map or a negotiating table. But they were now positioned at the center of a drama in which one would judge the other, in which the defeated would face the victor in what was nominally a legal proceeding. Whatever actual prejudice MacArthur may have harbored, the mere structure of the process was enough to raise profound questions about whether this could be a fair trial in any conventional sense of fairness. The Manila of early 1946 was a city caught between occupation and reconstruction, between victory and the obligation to administer justice. American soldiers patrolled streets that were still being cleared of rubble. Filipino civilians who had survived the war moved through their damaged city, some welcoming the American presence, others harboring complicated feelings about occupation by any power, however much preferable to the Japanese version. The contrast between the relatively orderly American occupation authorities and the chaotic conditions still prevailing in much of the city created an atmosphere of tension and instability. It was into this atmosphere that the tribunal preparing to try Homma was conducting its work, assembling evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for proceedings that would attempt to render justice in a place and time marked by profound disorder. The tribunal's courtroom was established in Manila, a space that would serve as the theater for the confrontation between the machinery of American military justice and a man who had spent nearly 4 years trying to forget that he had ever worn a uniform at all. Homma's psychological state during this period of detention and preparation is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but the available accounts and his later conduct suggest a man who had made peace with his circumstances, or at least accepted them, with the resignation that his culture and his generation expected of military officers facing defeat. He was permitted writing materials and spent some of his time in detention, composing letters and reflections, though the bulk of these have not survived or have not been made widely available. He maintained his dignity in his interactions with guards and with his defense counsel, offering no dramatics, no performances of remorse or defiance. He had lived through the humiliation of being effectively removed from command, while his campaign was still incomplete. He had endured the disgrace of being bypassed for promotion and sidelined into political irrelevance. In some ways, actual physical arrest and detention may have been less psychologically damaging than the slow death of his military career that he had already experienced. He was a man entering the final chapters of his life, knowing that those chapters would be written in an American military courtroom before officers who had every reason to wish him condemned. Whatever fate awaited him, at least it would be clear and final. The convening of the tribunal itself in early 1946 represented the culmination of months of preparation and the beginning of the process that would attempt to determine individual responsibility for the Bataan Death March and for the broader campaign in the Philippines. The courtroom was filled with American officers and lawyers, Filipino observers, Philippine government officials, international witnesses, and survivors of the march itself, all watching as the machinery of military justice prepared to operate. Homma, wearing a simple military uniform, was brought into the courtroom to face charges that would either result in his conviction and execution, or in some lesser outcome that almost no one at the time believed would occur. The gulf between the man who had commanded the 14th Army and the prisoner now before the tribunal was immense, but the legal process that would attempt to bridge that gulf was about to unfold, and everyone in the courtroom understood that the outcome would be significant, not merely for Homma, but for the broader question of how the victorious Allies would hold their defeated enemies accountable for the suffering their armies had inflicted. The military tribunal that would decide the fate of Masaharu Homma opened in Manila in the autumn of 1945, in a city still bearing the physical and psychological scars of war. The proceedings took place in a converted warehouse, its walls repaired, but not yet healed, and the very structure seemed to carry the weight of what was being adjudicated within it. American officers occupied the judge's bench. Interpreters stood ready to translate Japanese into English and English into Japanese, and in the dock sat a 63-year-old general, reduced now to the status of accused. The Philippines had been liberated only months before, and the wounds of occupation and combat were fresh enough that the smell of rubble still hung in Manila's air. This was not a trial conducted in the calm distance of time, but rather in the fever heat of a nation freshly emerged from occupation, with survivors and families of the dead present or nearby, their testimony woven into the proceedings themselves. The machinery of American military justice had been set in motion, and Homma stood at its fulcrum, aware that the outcome would be shaped not only by law, but by the particular rage and trauma of the moment. The tribunal itself operated under what legal scholars would later argue were extraordinary constraints and compromises with traditional principles of justice. The rules of evidence allowed hearsay testimony that would have been barred in an American civilian courtroom. The burden of proof seemed to shift at critical moments, and the timelines for preparation and deliberation were compressed in ways that prevented thorough examination of facts. Most controversially, General Douglas MacArthur himself held a dual authority that no legal system premised on separation of powers could comfortably accommodate. He was the convening authority who had established the tribunal. He appointed the judges who would hear the case, and he retained the right to review and affirm or reject any verdict they rendered. The prosecution, working under American auspices and representing American interests, enjoyed the advantage of that machinery, while the defense was forced to work within constraints that seemed to narrow with each preceding day. Homma's attorneys, both American and Japanese, found themselves arguing the law and the facts within boundaries that appeared to have been established before a single witness was sworn. The fundamental question of whether a man could receive a fair trial in the aftermath of atrocities he was accused of committing was never satisfactorily resolved. It was simply acknowledged and then set aside. The prosecution's case against Homma rested on a theory of command responsibility that had not been extensively tested in international or American military law before the Second World War. The argument was straightforward enough, that regardless of whether Homma had personally ordered the atrocities of the Bataan Death March, he bore responsibility as the commanding general for the actions of the soldiers under his command. If his subordinates committed murders, starved prisoners, or inflicted deliberate suffering, Homma was responsible by virtue of his position. The prosecution presented witness after witness, many of them survivors of the march itself, who testified to the horrors they had endured, the summary execution of men too weak to continue, the denial of water in the tropical heat, the bayoneting of stragglers, the cruel indifference of guards who appeared to view the prisoners with contempt. These testimonies were raw and devastating, and they served the prosecution's purpose of establishing that atrocities had indeed occurred and that prisoners had suffered on a catastrophic scale. Whether Homma had ordered these specific acts was almost beside the point in the prosecution's framework. The suffering had happened under his command, and that was sufficient. Homma's defense strategy occupied uncomfortable middle ground. He did not deny the suffering that had occurred on the march. He could not, given the weight of survivor testimony. Instead, he acknowledged command responsibility in principle, while arguing that the specific circumstances mitigated his culpability in practice. His assertion, developed through interpreters and his own testimony, delivered from the witness stand, was that he had been systematically sidelined during the critical period when the march was taking place. Tokyo had sent senior officers to oversee operations in the Philippines, effectively transferring operational control away from him, and this interference meant that his authority had been compromised at the precise moment when careful administration of the prisoner movement was most needed. Furthermore, Homma argued, he had not been fully informed of the extent of the atrocities as they occurred. Reports had filtered through to him incompletely, and the breakdown of communications and coordination that had led to the deaths had not been products of his explicit orders or his direct knowledge. He had not wanted the assignment in the first place, he reminded the tribunal. He had harbored doubts about the campaign's feasibility from the start, and he had been caught between impossible demands from Tokyo and the military realities he faced on the ground. The testimony of Homma himself was the centerpiece of the defense, and observers who witnessed it noted a certain dignity in his bearing, despite the gravity of the charges.